Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On tonight's show, I'm going to talk about one of my favorite history books. It was called The Conquest of New Spain, and it was written by Bernal Diaz del Castillo, also just basically known as Bernal Diaz. The reason this book came to mind was because of a recent article that was brought to my attention. It was published in July 1st, 2017. The title was Tower of Human Skulls Found in Mexico City Dig Cast Light on Aztec Sacrifices. Archaeologists find more than 650 skulls near the site of Templo Mayor. It was in the center of present-day Mexico City. But back at the time of the Mexican conquest, or the conquest of the Aztec Empire, it was known by a different name. I think it was Tenochtitlan, some old Mexican name. But just to read a little bit of the article. A tower of human skulls unearthed beneath the heart of Mexico City has raised new questions about the culture of sacrifice in the Aztec Empire after crania of women and children surfaced among the hundreds embedded in the forbidding structure. Archaeologists have found more than 650 skulls caked in lime and thousands of fragments in the cylindrical edifice near the site of the Templo Mayor, one of the main temples in the Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan, which later became Mexico City. The tower is believed to form part of the Huayzompantli, a massive array of skulls that struck fear into Spanish conquistadors when they captured the city under Hernán Cortés. The structure was mentioned in contemporary accounts. Historians relate how the severed heads of captured warriors adorned zompantli, or skull racks, found in a number of Mesoamerican cultures before the Spanish conquest. But the archaeological dig in the bowels of old Mexico City that began in 2015 suggests that picture was not complete. We were expecting just men, obviously young men, as warriors would be, and the thing about the women and children is you'd think they wouldn't be going to war, said Rodrigo Bolanos, a biological anthropologist investigating the find. Something is happening that we have no record of, and this is really new, a first in the Huayzompantli. Raul Barrera, one of the archaeologists working at the site alongside the huge metropolitan cathedral built over the Templo Mayor, said the skulls would have been set in the tower after they had stood on public display in the Zompantli. Roughly 6 meters in diameter, the tower stood on the corner of the chapel of Huitzilopochtli, the Aztec god of the sun, war, and human sacrifice. Its base has yet to be unearthed. There was no doubt that the tower was one of the skull edifices mentioned by Andrés de Tapia, a Spanish soldier who accompanied Cortés in the 1521 conquest of Mexico, Barrera said. In his account of the campaign, de Tapia said he counted tens of thousands of skulls in what became known as the Huayzompantli. Barrera said 676 skulls had been found, and the number would rise as excavations went on. The Aztecs and other Mesoamerican peoples performed ritualistic human sacrifices as offerings to the sun. So that's the entirety of that article. But that article brought to mind a book that I'd read 20 years ago, and I'd actually had a recent conversation with a friend about the book. So I'd like to talk a little bit about Bernal Diaz, a little bit about Hernando Cortés, and then do some reading from the true history of the conquest of New Spain. So Bernal Diaz was born in Spain like all of the other conquistadors, but the interesting thing about him is that he had been in two other adventures in the New World, in the Caribbean area. He had been to Panama. What they called in Panama was a different name. They referred to Panama as terra firma, and that's now known as Nombre de Dios in modern Panama. But he was there in 1514. But after 2 years, everybody got sick, so he left. That was the first adventure he had in that area. And then the second one is he went to Cuba, and basically had a difficult time in that area. But one of the interesting aspects is that in March 1517, he came to the Yucatan Peninsula. And a very critical event happened on the Yucatan Peninsula while he was there, is that he met some other Spaniards and who had been in a different shipwreck. And that one of those Spaniards would become a translator, because that Spaniard learned to speak Mayan. And during Hernán Cortés's conquest of Mexico, this Spaniard would be a critical linguistic asset for the conquistadors. But he had then returned back to Cuba, and that's where he became part of this campaign with Hernán Cortés. Hernan Cortez was one of the early colonists and from Spain and went to Cuba, where he came under the aegis of the local governor, a guy by the name of Governor Velasquez, who saw something in Cortez and gave him some land and some other things. But it was interesting thing about Cortez is that he had been in Cuba for about 10 or 15 years before he even set foot in Mexico. And he had seen and watched and heard stories of other failed missions, expeditions that had been taking place and had been gone to that area. But it was in 1518 that Cortez was in command of an expedition, and he basically, he was accompanied by 11 ships, 500 men, 13 horses, and cannon. And he initially landed in Mayan territory. And it was there, like I was talking about, that he came across a man by the name of Geronimo de Aguilar, a priest who had survived a shipwreck but had been in captivity. And it was there through this Franciscan priest that he was able to learn the language of the Maya that was locally there. So he then left this kind of Mayan in this Yucatan area and went to Tabasco. And there, he met a woman while he was in Tabasco, another woman by the name of La Malinche, who became Cortez's mistress. But the interesting thing about Malinche is that she knew the language of the Aztecs, Nahuatl, and she also knew Mayan. So Geronimo de Aguilar could speak Spanish with Hernan Cortez, talk Mayan to Malinche, who could then speak Aztec to the Aztecs. Eventually, when Hernan Cortez became in contact with them. So, and it was in 1519 that Cortez eventually met the head of the Aztec empire, a guy by the name of Moctezuma, or Montezuma, as they say here in the States, but it's Moctezuma is the appropriate pronunciation. So this is a reading from The Conquest of New Spain by Bernal Diaz. This is chapter 31 from Bernal Diaz. How we arrived at the Rio de Grijalva, which in the language of the Indians is called Tabasco, of the attack the Indians made on us, and what else happened to us with them. On the 12th of March, 1519, we arrived with all the fleet at the Rio de Grijalva, which is also called Tabasco. And as we already knew from our experience with Grijalva, that vessels of large size could not enter into the river. The larger vessels were anchored out at sea, and from the smaller vessels and boats, all the soldiers were landed at the Cape of the Palms, which is about half a league distant from the town of Tabasco. The river banks, and the mangrove thickets were swarming with Indians, at which those of us who had not been here in Grijalva's time were much astonished. In addition to this, there were assembled in the town more than 12,000 warriors, all prepared to make war on us. For at this time the town was of considerable importance, and other large towns were subject to it, and they had made all preparation for war, and were well supplied with the arms for which they are accustomed to use. The reason for this was that the people of Potonchan and Lazaro and the other towns in that neighborhood had looked upon the people of Tabasco as cowards, and had told them so to their faces, because they had given Grijalva the gold jewels which I have spoken about in an earlier chapter, and they said that they were too faint-hearted to attack us, although they had more towns and more warriors than the people of Potonchan and Lazaro. This they said to annoy them, and added that they in their towns had attacked us and killed 56 of us. So on account of those taunts which had been uttered, the people of Tabasco had determined to take up arms. When Cortez saw them drawn up, ready for war, he told Aguilar the interpreter, who spoke the language of Tabasco well, to ask the Indians who had passed near us in a large canoe and who looked like chiefs, what they were so much disturbed about, and to tell them that we had not come to do them any harm, but were willing to give them some of the things we had brought with us, and to treat them like brothers. And we prayed them not to begin a war, as they would regret it. And much else was said to them about keeping the peace. However, the more Aguilar talked to them, the more violent they became, and they said they would kill us all if we entered their town, and that it was fortified all around with fences and barricades of large trunks of trees. Aguilar spoke to them again and asked them to keep the peace, and to allow us to take water and barter our goods with them for food, and permit us to tell the Calachones, it must be like the caciques, the kind of bosses, things which would be to their advantage and to the service of God our Lord. But they still persisted in saying that if we advanced beyond the palm trees, they would kill us. When Cortez saw the state of affairs, he ordered the boats and small vessels to be got ready, and ordered 3 cannon to be placed in each boat, and divided the crossbowmen and musketeers among the boats. We remembered that when we were here with Grijalva, we had found a narrow path which ran across some streams from the palm grove to the town, and Cortez ordered 3 soldiers to find out in the night if that path ran right up to the houses, and not to delay in bringing the news, and these men found out that it did lead there. After making a thorough examination of our surroundings, the rest of the day was spent arranging how and in what order we were to go in the boats. The next morning we had our arms in readiness. After hearing the mass, Cortez ordered the captain Alonso de Avila and 100 soldiers among whom were 10 crossbowmen, to go by the little path which led to the town, and as soon as he had heard the guns fired, to attack the town on one side, while he attacked it on the other. Cortez himself and all the other captains and soldiers went in the boats and light draft vessels up the river. When the Indian warriors who were on the banks and among the mangroves saw that we were really on the move, they came after us with a great many canoes, intent to prevent our going ashore at the landing place, and the whole river bank appeared to be covered with Indian warriors carrying all the different arms which they used, and blowing trumpets and shells and sounding drums. When Cortez saw how matters stood, he ordered us to wait a little and not to fire any shots from guns or crossbows or cannon, for as he wished to be justified in all that he might do, he made another appeal to the Indians through the interpreter Aguilar, in the presence of the king's notary Diego de Godoy, asking the Indians to allow us to land and take water and speak to them about God and His Majesty, and adding that should they make war on us, that if in defending ourselves some should be killed and others hurt, theirs would be the fault, and the burden it would not lie with us, but they went on threatening that if we landed they would kill us. Then they boldly began to let fly arrows at us, and made signals with their drums. Like valiant men, they surrounded us with their canoes, and they all attacked us with such a shower of arrows that they kept us in the water, in some parts up to our waists. As there was much mud and swamp at that place, we could not easily get clear of it, so many Indians fell on us, and what with some hurling their lances with all their might, and others shooting arrows at us, we could not reach the land as soon as we wished. While Cortez was fighting, he lost a shoe in the mud and could not find it again, and got on shore with 1 foot bare. Presently someone picked up the shoe out of the mud and put it on again. While this was happening to Cortez, all of us captains as well as soldiers with the cry of Santiago, fell upon the Indians and forced them to retreat, but they did not fall back far, as they sheltered themselves behind great barriers and stockades formed of thick logs, until we pulled them apart and got to one of the small gateways of the town. There we attacked them again, and we pushed them along through a street where other defenses had been erected, and there they turned on us and met us face to face and fought most valiantly, making the greatest efforts, shouting and whistling and crying Al Calacione, which in their language meant in order to kill or capture our captain. While we were thus surrounded by them, Alonso de Avila and his soldiers came up. As I've already said, they came from the palm grove by land, and could not arrive sooner on account of the swamps and creeks. Their delay was unavoidable, but just as we had been delayed over the summons of the Indians to surrender, and in breaking the openings of the barricades so as to enable us to attack them, now we all joined together to drive the enemy out of their strongholds, and we compelled them to retreat. But like brave warriors, they kept on shooting showers of arrows and fire-hardened darts, and never turned their backs on us, until we gained a great court with chambers and large halls, and 3 idol houses, where they had already carried all the goods they possessed. Cortez then ordered us to halt, and not to follow on and overtake the enemy in their flight. There and then Cortez took possession of that land for His Majesty, performing the act in His Majesty's name. It was done in this way. He drew his sword, and as a sign of possession, he made 3 cuts in a huge tree called a ceiba, which stood in the court of that great square, and cried that if any person should raise objection, that he would defend the right with the sword and shield which he held in his hands. All of us soldiers were present when this happened, and cried out that he did right in taking possession of the land in His Majesty's name, and we would aid him should any person say otherwise. This act was done in the presence of the royal notary. The partisans of Diego Velazquez choose to grumble at this act of taking possession. So there was another battle in that same area, in the area of Tabasco, and this is back to the narrative by Bernal Diaz. I have already said how we were marching along when we met all the forces of the enemy, which were moving in search of us, and all the men wore great feather crests, and they carried drums and trumpets, and their faces were colored black and white, and they were armed with large bows and arrows, lances and shields and swords, shaped like our 2-handed swords, and many slings and stones and fire-hardened javelins, and all wore quilted cotton armor. As they approached us, their squadrons were so numerous that they covered the whole plain, and they rushed on us like mad dogs, completely surrounding us, and they let fly such a cloud of arrows, javelins, and stones that on the first assault they wounded over 70 of us, and fighting hand to hand, they did us great damage with their lances, and one soldier fell dead at once from an arrow wound to the ear, and they kept shooting and wounding us. With our muskets and crossbows and with good swordplay, we did not fail as stout fighters, and when they came to feel the edge of our swords little by little, they fell back, but it was only as to shoot at us in greater safety. Mesa, our artilleryman, killed many of them with his cannon, for they were formed in great squadrons and did not open out so that he could fire at them as he pleased. But with all the hurts and wounds of which we gave them, we could not drive them off. I said to Diego de Ordaz, "It seems to me that we ought to close up and charge them, for in truth they suffered greatly from the strokes and thrusts of our swords, and that was why they fell away from us, both from fear of these swords, and the better to shoot their arrows and hurl their javelins and the hail of stones." Ordaz replied that it was not good advice, for there were 300 Indians to every one of us, and that we could not hold out against such a multitude. So there we stood, enduring their attack. However, we did agree to get as near as we could to them, as I had advised Ordaz, so as to give them a bad time with our swordsmanship, and they suffered so much from it that they retreated towards the swamp. During this time, Cortez and his horsemen failed to appear, although we greatly longed for them, and we feared that by chance some disaster had befallen them. I remember that when we fired shots, the Indians gave great shouts and whistles and threw dust and rubbish into the air, so that we could not see the damage done to them, and they sounded their trumpets and drums and shouted and whistled and cried. Just at this time we caught sight of our horsemen, and as the great Indian host was crazed with its attack on us, it did not at once perceive them coming up behind their backs, and as the plain was level ground, and the horsemen were good riders, and many of the horses were very handy and fine gallopers, they came quickly on the enemy, and speared them as they chose. As soon as we saw the horsemen, we fell on the Indians with such energy, that with us attacking on one side and the horsemen on the other, they soon turned tail. The Indians thought that the horse and its rider was all one animal, for they had never seen horses up to this time. The savannas and fields were crowded with Indians running to take refuge in the thick woods nearby. After we had defeated the enemy, Cortez told us he had not been able to come to us sooner as there was a swamp in the way, and he had to fight his way through another force of warriors before he could reach us. 3 horsemen and 5 horses had been wounded. As soon as the horsemen had dismounted under some trees and houses, we returned thanks to God for giving us so complete a victory. As it was Lady Day, we gave to the town which was afterwards founded here the name Santa Maria de la Victoria, on account of this great victory being won on Our Lady's Day. This was the first battle that we fought under Cortez in New Spain. After this we bound up the hurts of the wounded with cloths, for we had nothing else, and we doctored the horses by searing their wounds with the fat from the body of a dead Indian, which we cut up to get out the fat. And we went to look at the dead lying on the plain, and there were more than 800 of them, the greater number killed by thrusts, the others by the cannon, muskets, and crossbows, and many were stretched out on the ground half dead. Where the horsemen had passed, numbers of them lay dead and groaning from their wounds. The battle lasted for over an hour, and the Indians fought all the time like brave warriors, up until the horsemen came up. We took 5 prisoners, 2 of them captains. As it was late and we had enough of fighting, we had not eaten anything, so we returned to our camp. Then we buried the 2 soldiers who had been killed, one by a wound in the ear and the other by a wound in the throat. And we seared the wounds of the others and of the horses with the fat of the Indian, and after posting sentinels and guards, we had supper and rested. After this first victorious battle, Cortez decides he wants to speak to the local chieftains, so he sends out messengers, and they come to greet Cortez. The next day, 30 Indian chieftains, clad in good cloaks, came to visit us and brought fowls, fish, fruit, and maize cakes, and asked leave from Cortez to burn and bury the bodies of the dead who had fallen in the recent battles, so that they should not smell badly or be eaten by lions and tigers. Permission was at once given them, and they hastened to bring many people to bury and burn the bodies according to their customs. Cortez learned from the caciques that over 800 men were missing, not counting those who had been carried off wounded. They said they could not tarry with either to discuss the matter or make peace, for on the morrow the chieftains and leaders of all the towns would have assembled, and then they would agree about a peace. As Cortez was very sagacious about everything, he said, laughing, to us soldiers who happened to be in his company, "Do you know, gentlemen, that it seems to me that the Indians are terrified at the horses, and may think that they and the cannon alone make war on them. I have thought of something which will confirm this belief, and that is to bring the mare belonging to Juan Cedeño, which foaled the other day on board ship, and tie her up where I am now standing, and also bring the stallion of Ortiz, the musician, which is very excitable, near enough to scent the mare, and when he has scented her, to lead them off separately, so the caciques who are coming shall not hear the horse neighing as they approach, not until they are standing before me and are talking to me." We did just as Cortez ordered, and brought the horse and mare, and the horse soon detected the scent of her in Cortez's quarters. In addition to this, Cortez ordered the largest cannon that we possessed to be loaded with a large ball and a good charge of powder. About midday, 40 Indians arrived, all of them caciques of good bearing, wearing rich mantles such as are used by them. They saluted Cortez and all of us, and brought incense and fumigated all of us who were present, and they asked pardon for their past behavior, and said that henceforth they would be friendly. Cortez, through Aguilar the interpreter, answered them in a very grave manner, as though he were angry, that they well knew how many times he had asked them to maintain peace, that the fault was theirs, and that now they deserved to be put to death, they and all the people of their towns, but that as we were the vassals of a great king and lord named Emperor Don Carlos, who had sent us to these countries and ordered us to help and favor those who would enter into his royal service, that if they were now as well disposed as they were said they were, that we would take this course, and that if they were not, some of these people would jump out and kill them. And some of the warriors were still angry because they had made war on us. At this moment the order was secretly given to put on a match to the cannon which had been loaded, and it went off with such a thunderclap as was wanted, and the ball went buzzing over the hills, as it was midday, and very still it made a great noise, and the caciques were terrified on hearing it. As they had never seen anything like it, they believed what Cortez had told them was true. And Cortez told them, through Aguilar, not to be afraid, for he had given orders that no harm should be done to them. Just then the horse that had scented the mare was brought up and tied up not far distant from where Cortez was talking to the caciques. And as the mare had been tied up at the place where Cortez and the Indians were talking, the horse began to paw the ground and neigh, and become wild with excitement, looking all the time towards the Indians and the place whence the scent of the mare had reached him. And the caciques thought that he was roaring at them, and they were terrified. When Cortez observed their state of mind, he rose from his seat and went to the horse and told 2 orderlies to lead it far away, and said to the Indians that he had told the horse not to be angry, as they were friendly and wished to make peace. While this was going on, there arrived more than 30 Indian carriers, of whom the natives call temenes, who brought a meal of fowls, fish, fruits, and other food, and it appears they had lagged behind and could not reach us at the same time as the caciques. Cortez had a long conversation with these chieftains and caciques, and they told them that they would all come on the next day and bring a present, and would discuss other matters. Then they went quite away contented. So you can see from this narrative how clever Cortez was in dealing with the natives and how he used the cannon and the horses to terrify the locals. The lords of the local area provided Cortez with 30 women, and Cortez impressed upon them the potency of his emperor. And we return to the narrative. It says, "We remained 5 days in this town to look after the wounded and those who were suffering from pain in the loins, from which they all recovered. Furthermore, Cortez drew the caciques to him by kindly converse, and told them how our master the emperor, whose vassals we were, and under his orders had many great lords, and that it would be well for them also to render him obedience, and that then, whatever might be in need of, whether it was our protection or any other necessity, if they would make it known to him, no matter where he might be, he would come to their assistance. The caciques all thanked him for this, and thereupon all declared themselves the vassals of our great emperor. They were the first vassals to render submission to his majesty in New Spain. Cortez then ordered the caciques to come with their women and children early the next day, which was Palm Sunday, to the altar and pay home homage to the holy image of Our Lady and to the cross, and at the same time Cortez ordered them to send 6 Indian carpenters to accompany our carpenters to the town of Cintla, where our Lord God was pleased to give us victory in the battle which I have described, and there to cut a cross on a great tree called a ceiba, which grew there. And they did it so that it might last a long time, for as the bark is renewed, the cross will show there forever. When this was done, he ordered the Indians to get ready all the canoes that they had owned to help us to embark, for we wished to set sail on that holy day, because the pilots had come to tell Cortez that the ships ran a great risk from a northern, which is a dangerous gale." So you can see right here that as part of his conquest was the conversion of all the locals to Christianity. And it was in the port of San Juan de Ulua where Cortez met the emissaries of Montezuma, the chief of the Aztec Indians. Back to the narrative. The flagship hoisted her royal standards and pennants, and within half an hour of anchoring, 2 large canoes, which in these parts are called piraguas, came out to us, full of Mexican Indians. Seeing the big ship with the standards flying, they knew that it was there they must go to speak with the captain. So they went direct to the flagship, and going on board, asked who was the Tatuan, which in their language means the chief. Dona Marina, one of the translators, who understood the language, pointed him out. Then the Indians paid many marks of respect to Cortez, according to their usage, and bade him welcome, and said that their lord, a servant of the great Montezuma, had sent them to ask what kind of men we were, and what we were in search, and added that if we were in need of anything for ourselves or our ships, that we should tell them, and they would supply it. Our Cortez thanked them through the 2 interpreters, Aguilar and Dona Marina, and ordered food and wine to be given them, and some blue beads. And after they had drunk, he told them that we had come to see them and to trade with them, and that our arrival in their country should cause them no uneasiness, but looked on by them as fortunate. By the end of this narrative, the local Indians would not think the arrival of the Spanish was fortunate. I'm going to skip forward to chapter 58 and discuss Cortez's decision to burn his ships and move inland to the capital of Mexico, Tenochtitlan. So I return here to the narrative. Being in Zempoala, as I have stated, and discussing with Cortez questions of warfare and our advance into the country, and going on from one thing to another, we, who were his friends, counseled him, although others opposed it, not to leave a single ship in the port, but to destroy them all at once, so as to leave no source of trouble behind, lest when we were inland others of our people should rebel like the last. Besides, we should gain much additional strength from the masters, the pilots, and sailors, who numbered nearly 100 men, and they would be better employed helping us to watch and fight than remaining in port. As far as I can make out, this matter of destroying the ships, which we had suggested to Cortez during our conversation, had already been decided on by him, but he wished it to appear as though it came from us, so that if anyone should ask him to pay for the ships, he could say that he had acted on our advice, and we would all be concerned in their payment. Then he sent Juan de Escalante, who was chief alguacil, and a person of distinguished bravery and a great friend of Cortez, and an enemy of Diego Velazquez, because he had not given him good Indians on the island of Cuba, to Villarica with orders to bring on shore all the anchors, cables, sails, and everything else on board which might prove useful, then to destroy the ships and preserve nothing but the boats, and that the pilots, sailing masters, and sailors, who were old and of no use for war, should stay at the town. With the 2 nets they possessed should undertake the fishing, for there was always fish in that harbor, although they were not very plentiful. Juan de Escalante did all that he was told to do, and soon after arrived at Zempoala with a company of sailors who he had brought from the ships, and some of them turned out to be very good soldiers. When this was done, Cortez sent to summon all the caciques of the hill towns that were allied to us in rebellion against Montezuma, and told them how they must give their service to the Spaniards who remained in Villarica, and to finish building the church, fortress, and houses. And Cortez took Juan de Escalante by the hand before them all, and said to them, "This is my brother," and told them to do whatever he should order them, and that should they need protection or assistance against the Mexicans, they should go to him, and he would come in person to their assistance. All the caciques willingly promised to do what might be asked of them, and I remember that they at once fumigated Juan de Escalante with incense, though he did not wish it done. I have already said that he was a man well qualified for any post and a great friend of Cortez, so he could place him in command of the town and harbor with confidence, so that if Diego Velazquez should send an expedition there, it would meet with resistance. I must leave him here and go on with my story. When the ships had been destroyed, with our full knowledge, when all the captains and soldiers were assembled and were talking to Cortez about military matters, he begged us to listen to him, and argued with us as follows. Quote, "We all understood what was the work that lay before us, and that with the help of our Lord Jesus Christ, we must conquer in all battles and encounters, and must be as ready for them as was befitting. For if we or any were defeated, which pray God would not happen, we could not raise our heads again, as we were so few in numbers, and we could look for no help or assistance, but that which came from God. For we no longer possess ships in which to return to Cuba, but must rely on our own good swords and stout hearts." And he went on to draw many comparisons and relate the heroic deeds of the Romans. Once and all we answered him that we would obey his orders, and that when the die was cast for good fortune, as Caesar said when he crossed the Rubicon, that we were all of us ready to serve God and the king. After this excellent speech, which was delivered with more honeyed words and greater eloquence than I can express here, Cortez at once sent for the fat cacique, and reminded him that he should treat the church and cross with great reverence and keep them clean. And he also told them that he meant to depart at once for Mexico, to order Montezuma not to rob or offer human sacrifices, and that he now had need of 200 Indian carriers to transport his artillery, for as I've already said, these Indians can carry 2 arrobas on their backs and march 5 leagues with it. He also asked 50 of the leading warriors to go with us. When our departure for Mexico had received full consideration, we sought advice as to the road we should take, and the chieftains of Zempoala were agreed that the best and most convenient road for us to take was through the province of Tlaxcala, for they were their allies and mortal enemies of the Mexicans. 40 chieftains, all warriors, were already prepared to accompany us and were of great assistance to us on that journey, and they provided us as well with 200 carriers to transport our artillery. We poor soldiers had no need of help, for at that time we had nothing to carry except our arms, lances, muskets, crossbows, shields, and the like, with which we both marched and slept, and we were shod with hempen shoes, as I have often said, and were always prepared for a fight. In the middle of August 1519, we set out from Zempoala, keeping always in good formation, and with scouts and some of the most active soldiers in advance. The first day we marched to the town called Jalapa, then to Xochimilco, a strong place with a difficult approach, and inside there were many vines of the grapes of the country on trellises. In both those towns, through our interpreters, Doña Marina and Geronimo the Aguilar, all matters touching our holy religion were explained to the people, that we were the vassals of the Emperor Don Carlos, who had sent us to put an end to human sacrifices and robbery, and that they were told other things which is advantageous to state. As they were friends of the Sempualans and did not pay tribute to Montezuma, we found them very well disposed towards us, and they provided us with food. A cross was erected in each town, and its meaning was explained to them, and they were told to hold it in great reverence. As soon as we had eaten, Cortez asked through our interpreters about their lord Montezuma. The chief told us of his great strength in warriors, which he kept in all the provinces under his sway, without counting many other armies which were posted on the frontiers and in neighboring provinces, and that Montezuma then spoke of the great fortress of Mexico, how the houses were built in the water, and how one can only pass from one house to another by means of bridges which they have made or canoes, and how all the houses have flat roofs, which by raising breastworks when they are needed can be turned into fortresses, that the city is entered by 3 causeways, each causeway having 4 or 5 openings in it, through which the water can flow from one part to the other, and each opening has a wooden bridge over it, so that any one of the bridges is raised. When any one of the bridges is raised, no one can enter the city of Mexico. Then the chief told us of the great store of gold and silver, and the stones and other riches which Montezuma his lord possessed, and he never ceased telling us how great a lord he was, so that Cortez and all of us marveled at hearing him. The more he told us about the great fortress and bridges, of such stuff we Spanish soldiers made, the more we wanted to try our luck against them, although it seemed a hopeless enterprise, judging from what Olentecle explained and told us. In reality, Mexico was much stronger and had better munitions and defenses than anything he told us about, for it is one thing to have seen the place itself and its strength, quite another to describe it as I do. He added that Montezuma was so great a prince that he placed anything he chose under his rule, and that he did not know if he would be pleased when he heard of our stay in that town, and that we had been given lodgings and food without his permission. Cortez replied through our interpreters, I would have you know that we have come from distant lands at the order of our lord and king, the Emperor Don Carlos, who has many and great princes as his vassals, and he sends us to command your great prince Montezuma not to sacrifice or kill any more Indians, or to rob his vassals, or to seize any more lands, but to give his fealty to our lord the king. And now I say the same to you, Olentecle, and to all the other caciques who are with you. Desist from your sacrifices, and no longer eat the flesh of your own relations, and cease to commit sodomy and other evil customs which you practice, for such is the will of our Lord God, whom we believe in and worship, the giver of life and death, who will take us up to heaven. He told of them of many other things concerning our holy religion, all of to which things they made no reply. Then here in this section titled 100,000 Human Skulls, Bernal Diaz describes these stone human skull towers. Quote, I remember that in the plaza where some of their oratories stood, there were piles of human skulls so regularly arranged that one could count them, and I estimated them at more than 100,000. I repeat again that there were more than 100,000 of them, and in another part of the plaza there were so many piles of dead men's thigh bones that one could not count them. There was also a large number of skulls strung out between beams of wood, and 3 priests who had charge of these bones and skulls were guarding them. We had occasion to see many such things later on as we penetrated into the country, for the same custom was observed in all the towns, including those of Tlaxcala. On their way to the Mexican capital, Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztecs, Cortez and his group encounters a group of Tlaxcalans and fights his way through their city. Quote, the next day, after commending ourselves to God, we set out with all our ranks in good order, the horsemen well instructed in the way they should charge through the enemy and return to us, and see that the enemy should not be permitted to break our ranks and separate us one from the other. As we thus marched on, 2 armies of warriors approached to give us battle. They numbered 6,000 men, with loud shouts and the din of drums and trumpets, as they shot their arrows and hurled their darts and acted like brave warriors. Cortez ordered us to halt, and sent forward the 3 prisoners whom we had captured the day before, to tell them not to make war on us, as we wished to treat them as brothers. He also told one of our soldiers, Diego de Godoy, who was a royal notary, to watch what took place so that he could bear witness if it should be necessary, so that at some future time we should not have to answer for the deaths and damages which we were likely to take place, for we begged them to keep the peace. When the 3 prisoners whom we had sent forward began to speak to the Indians, it only increased their fury, and they made such an attack on us that we could not endure it. Then Cortez shouted, Santiago, and at them, and we attacked them with such impetuosity that we killed and wounded many of them with our fire, and among them 3 captains. Then they began to retire toward some ravines, where over 40,000 warriors and their captain general, named Xicotenga, were lying in ambush, all wearing a red and white device, for that was the badge and livery of Xicotenga. As there was broken ground there, we could make no use of the horses, but by careful maneuvering we got past it. But the passage was very perilous, for they made play with their good archery, and with their lances and broadswords did us much hurt, and the hail of stones from their slings was ever more damaging. When we reached the level ground with our horsemen and artillery, we paid them back and slew many of them. But we did not dare break our formation, for any soldier who left the ranks to follow some of the Indian captains and swordsmen was at once wounded and ran great danger. As the battle went on, they surrounded us on all sides, and we could do little or nothing. We dared not charge them unless we charged all together, lest they should break up our formation. And if we did charge them, as I have said, there were 20 squadrons ready to resist us, and our lives were in great danger, for they were so numerous they could have blinded us with handfuls of earth, if God in his great mercy had not succored us. While we found ourselves in this conflict among these great warriors and their fearful broadswords, we noticed that many of the strongest among them crowded together to lay hands on a horse. They set to work with a furious attack, laying hands on a good mare, known to be very handy for either sport or for charging. The rider, Pedro de Moron, was a very good horseman, and as he charged with 3 other horsemen into the ranks of the enemy, the Indian seized hold of his lance, and he was not able to drag it away, and others gave him cuts with their broadswords and wounded him badly. Then they slashed at the mare and cut her head off at the neck, so that it hung by the skin, and she fell dead. If his mounted companions had not come at once to his rescue, they would have also finished killing Pedro de Moron. We might have possibly helped him with our whole battalion, but I repeat again, we hardly dared to move from one place to another for fear that they would finally rout us, and we could not move one way or another. It was all we could do to hold our own and prevent ourselves from being defeated. However, we rushed to the conflict around the mare and managed to save Moron from the hands of the enemy, who were already dragging him off half dead, and we cut the mare's girths so as not to leave the saddle behind. In that act of rescue, 10 of our men were wounded, and I remember at the same time we killed 4 of the Indian captains, for we were advancing in close order, and we did great execution with our swords. When this had happened, our enemy began to retire, carrying the mare with them, and they cut her in pieces to exhibit in all the towns of Tlaxcala. And we learnt afterwards that they made an offering to their idols of the horseshoes, and of the Flemish felt hat, and the 2 letters which we had sent them offering peace. The mare that was killed belonged to Juan Cedeno, and it was because Cedeno had received 3 wounds the day before that he had given her to Moron, who was a good horseman. I did not see Moron again, for he died of his wounds 2 days later. To return to our battle, we were a full hour fighting in the fray, and our shots must have done the enemy much damage, for they were so numerous and in such close formation that each shot must have hit many of them. Horsemen, musketeers, crossbowmen, swordsmen, and those who used lance and shield, one and all, we fought like men to save our lives and do our duty, for we were certainly in the greatest danger in which we had ever found ourselves. Later on they told us that we killed many Indians in this battle, among them 8 of their leading captains, sons of the old caciques who lived in their principal town, and for this reason they drew off in good order. We did not attempt to follow them, for we were not sorry as that we were so tired out we could hardly stand, and we stayed where we were in that little town. All of the country round was thickly peopled, and they even had some underground houses, like caves which many of the Indians live. The place where this battle took place is called Tuacachingo, and it was fought on the 2nd day of the month of September in the year 1519. When we saw that victory was ours, we gave thanks to God, who would deliver us from such great danger. On to chapter 72. Quote, as our Lord God, through his great loving kindness, was pleased to give us victory in those battles in Tlaxcala, our fame spread throughout the surrounding country, and reached the ears of the great Montezuma in the great city of Mexico. And if hitherto they took us for tueles, which is the same as their idols, from now on they held us in even greater respect as valiant warriors, and terror fell on the whole country at learning how, being so few in number in the Tlaxcalans and such great force, we had conquered them, and that they had sued us for peace. So that now Montezuma, the great prince of Mexico, powerful as he was in fear of our going into his city, and sent 5 chieftains, men of much importance, to our camp at Tlaxcala to bid us welcome, and say that he was rejoiced at our great victory against so many squadrons of warriors, as he sent a present, a matter of $1,000 worth of gold, and a very rich jeweled ornaments, worked in various shapes, and 20 loads of fine cotton cloth. And he sent word that he wished to become a vassal of our great emperor, and that he was pleased that we were already near his city on account of the goodwill that he bore Cortez and all his brothers, the Tueles, who were with him, and that he, Cortez, should decide on how much tribute he wished for every year of our great emperor, and that he, Montezuma, would give it in gold and silver, cloth, and chalchihuites, provided we would not come to Mexico. This was not because he would not receive us with the greatest willingness, but because the land was so rough and sterile, he would regret to see us undergo such hardships as perchance he might not be able to alleviate as well as he could wish. Cortez answered by saying that he highly appreciated the goodwill shown us, and the present which had been sent, and he offered to pay tribute to his majesty, and he begged the messengers not to depart until he went into the capital of Tlaxcala, as he would dispatch them from that place, and they could then see how that the war had ended. So while Cortez was in Tlaxcala, he asked some of the head chieftains about Montezuma in Mexico, and here's what they replied. Quote, he said that Montezuma had such great strength in warriors that when he wished to capture a great city or make a raid on a province, he could place 150,000 men in the field, and this they knew well from the experience of the wars and hostilities they had had with them for more than 100 years past. Cortez asked them how it was that so many warriors, as they said, came down on them, as they had never been entirely conquered. They answered that although Mexicans sometimes defeated them and killed them, and carried off many of their vassals for sacrifice, many of the enemy were also left dead on the field, and others were made prisoners, so that they never could come so secretly that they not get some warning, and that when they knew of their approach, they mustered all their forces, and with the help of the people of Huichotzingo, they defended themselves and made counterattacks. That as all the provinces which had been raided by Montezuma and placed under his rule were ill-disposed towards Mexicans, and that their inhabitants were carried off by force to the wars, and they did not fight with good will. Indeed, it was from these very men that they received warnings, and for this reason they had defended their country to the best of their ability. And they told us about the great staff of servants in his house, and the story would never cease were I to attempt to describe it all here, and of the many women he possessed, and how he married off some of them. In fact, they gave us an account of everything. Then they spoke of the great fortifications of the city, what the lake was like, and the depth of the water, and about the causeways that give access to the city, and the wooden bridges in each causeway, and how one can go in and out by water through the opening that there is in each bridge, and how when the bridges are raised, one can be cut off between the bridge and not be able to reach the city. How the greater part of the city was built in the lake, and that one could not pass from house to house except by drawbridges and canoes which they all had ready. That all the houses were flat-roofed, and all the roofs were provided with parapets, so they could fight from them. They also told us about the way the city was provided with fresh water from a spring called Chapultepec, distant about half a league from the city, and how the water enters by aqueduct and reaches a place where they can carry it in canoes and sell it in the streets. When they told us about the arms that were used, such as two-pronged javelins which they hurl with throwing sticks, and will go through any sort of armor, and that there are many good archers, and others with lances with flint edges, which have a fathom of cutting edge, so cleverly made they cut better than knives, and they have shields and cotton armor, and there are many slingers who sling rounded stones, and others with very good and long lances, stone-edged, two-handed swords. They brought us pictures of the battles they had fought with the Mexicans, painted on large henequen cloths, showing their manner of fighting. As our captain and all of us had already heard about all that the caciques were telling us, we changed the subject, and started them on another more profound, which was, how was it that they had come to inhabit that land, and from what direction had they come? And how was it that they had differed so much from and were so hostile to the Mexicans, seeing that their countries were so close to one another? They said that their ancestors had told them that in times past there had lived among them men and women of giant size with huge bones, and because they were very bad people of evil manners, that they had fought with them and killed them, and those of them who remained died off. So that we could see how huge and tall these people had been, they brought us a leg bone of one of them which was very thick, and the height of a man of ordinary stature, and that was the bone from the hip to the knee. I measured myself against it, and it was as tall as I am, although I am of fair size. They brought other pieces of bone like the first, but they were already eaten away and destroyed by the soil. We were all amazed at seeing these bones, and felt sure there must have been giants in this country, and our Captain Cortez said to us that it would be well to send the great bone to Castile, so that his Majesty might see it. So we sent it with the first of our agents who went there. These caciques also told us that they had learned from their forefathers that one of their idols, to which they paid the greatest devotion, had told them that men would come from distant lands in the direction of the rising sun to subjugate them and govern them, and that if we were those men, they were rejoiced at it, as we were so good and brave. That when they made their peace with us, they had borne in mind that their idols had said, and for this reason they had given us their daughters, so as to obtain relations who would defend them against the Mexicans. When they finished their discourse, we were all astounded and said, can they possibly have spoken the truth? Then our Captain Cortez replied to them and said that certainly we came from the direction of the sunrise, that our Lord and King had sent us for this very purpose, that we should become as brothers to them. For he had heard of them, and he prayed God to give us grace, so that by our hands and our intercession they would be saved. And we all said, Amen. So that's a great place to stop in this narrative. Again, that was The Conquest of New Spain by Bernal Diaz, a very detailed analysis of Hernan Cortez's conquest of Mexico, detailing from the landing to all the battles to the final victory of the Spanish conquistadors. So I hope you enjoyed the show. I will include links to the books that you can find online, and this was only page 288 of about 1,000 pages of information, so there's a lot more to talk about. But thank you. Have a good evening. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On tonight's show, I will be reading from the second part of Conquest of New Spain by Bernal Diaz. Last week, I covered the arrival of Cortez to the New World, his finding of 2 interpreters, and his march from the coast into the inner parts of Mexico, or back then New Spain, and the conquest of the Tlaxcalans. There was a huge battle between him and the Tlaxcalans. If you didn't catch the first part, you can go check it out on my YouTube channel under William Ramsey Investigates. Thank you. Quote, after a repose of 17 days in Tlaxcala, it was determined to prosecute our march to Mexico. Upon this subject, much difference of opinion existed, the rich settlers of Cuba being very adverse to it. The resolution which we had taken grieved our friends of Tlaxcala, who earnestly advised us by no means to trust Montezuma or his people, nor their smooth and courteous words and manners, for that they were treacherous in the extreme, and would either retain us to breed men for Montezuma's service, or in a favorable hour would fall upon us and destroy us. But in case of our having hostilities with them, they advised us to kill all, neither sparing or the rising youth, nor the aged counselor. Cortez thanked and proposed to them an amicable treaty with their neighbors the Mexicans, but they would not hear of this, saying that they could not trust those who would only under a veil of peace better execute their treacherous designs. In regard to our road, the Mexican ambassadors earnestly recommended that by Cholula, but our friends of Tlaxcala as strongly advised us by no means to go that way, but by Huachingo. Nevertheless, we determined to go by Cholula, intending to remain there until we could by negotiation obtain a peaceable entry into Mexico. Cortez therefore lent messengers to that place to inform the chiefs of his intention, and expressing his dissatisfaction that they had not come to wait upon him. At this time arrived 4 of the principal nobility of Mexico with a rich present. It consisted of gold to the value of 10,000 crowns, and 10 bales of the finest mantles of feathers. Having saluted Cortez with the profoundest respect, the ambassadors delivered the message of their monarch, which was to this effect: that he wondered at our stay amongst a people so poor and base as the Tlaxcalans, who were robbers, and unfit even for slaves, and he earnestly requested that we would immediately visit his capital. Cortez replied, assuring them that he would shortly pay his respects to the great Montezuma, requesting their stay with him during the interval. He also determined to send 2 cavaliers as ambassadors to wait on Montezuma and view the city of Mexico. The persons he pitched on were Pedro de Alvarado and B. Vasquez de Tapia. They set out on their journey, accompanying the former Mexican ambassadors who had hitherto continued with us. I was at this time ill of my wounds and of a fever, and therefore incapable of observing exactly all that passed, but I know that their going thither appeared to us a very unwise measure, and in consequence of our remonstrances they were recalled. The chiefs of Cholula now sent us 4 men of low condition, with a very dry and uncourteous answer to our message, and without any present whatsoever. This evidently appeared to be done in contempt, and Cortez sent notice to them that if their chiefs did not wait upon him in 3 days, they should be considered as rebels, that in the case of their compliance he would be happy to esteem them as brothers, and had much to tell them of great importance. They then sent word that they dare not come amongst the enemies of the Tlaxcalans, who they knew had misrepresented them and the great Montezuma to us, but they requested that we would visit their city, where they would give us an honorable reception. When the Tlaxcalans saw our determination to accept this proposal, they told us that since we were resolved to neglect their advice, they expected that we would take with us 10,000 of their best warriors. This was thought, too, a great number for a peaceable visit. We, however, agreed to take 2,000, which were immediately ready to attend us. Being well prepared against whatever might happen, we now set out on our march, and arrived in the evening at a river, distant a short league from Cholula, where a stone bridge is now built across it. Here some of the chiefs of the city came to congratulate us on our arrival. Continuing our march on the next day, when we came near the city, we were met by the chiefs and priests in a body, all dressed in cassocks of cotton, resembling those of the Zapotecans. The chiefs presented their incense to Cortez, and after apologizing for not having gone to Tlaxcala, requested that he would not permit so large a body of their enemies to enter the city. This appearing reasonable, Cortes sent Alvarado and Dioli to desire our allies to hut themselves in the field, and we then marched on, attended only by the Indians of Sempoal and those who drew the artillery. Before he entered the city, he made known to those people the objects of his mission, as had already been frequently related. They replied without hesitation that, to our monarch, they were perfectly ready to yield immediate obedience, which they did. But as to that, abandoning their ancient religion, they could not comply with any such demand. When we entered their city, we were concluded through an immense crowd which filled the streets and terraces to our quarters in some large apartments, which contained us, our allies of Sempoal, and those who conveyed the artillery and baggage. During the time we stayed here, a plot was concerted by the ambassadors of Montezuma for the entry of 20,000 of his troops into this city to fall upon us, and several houses were filled with poles and leathern collars, in which they were to have brought us prisoners to Mexico, but that God was pleased to foil their designs. For the first 2 days we were entertained as well as we could wish, but on the third we received no provisions, nor did either chief of priest make his appearance. The very few inhabitants that we saw withdrew from us with a mysterious kind of sneer in their faces, and Cortes at this time, applying to the ambassadors to procure for us some provisions as usual, all that we obtained was a little wood and water conveyed by some old men, who told us that no maize was to be had. On this day ambassadors arrived from Montezuma, who, in very disrespectful terms, forbid our approach to Mexico, and required an immediate answer. Cortes mildly expressed his surprise at this alteration. He made them a present, and requested a short delay, to which they acceded. He then, summoning his soldiers, warned us to be alert, for that he suspected some great treachery. The chiefs having refused to attend him, he immediately sent some soldiers to a great temple hard by our quarters, with orders to bring, as quietly as they could, 2 of the priests. In this they succeeded without any difficulty, and the priests being brought before the general, he made a present to each, and then inquired the reason of these extraordinary appearances. One of them was a person of rank and authority over all the temples of the city, in the manner of a hilltop. This person assured him that if he had an opportunity of speaking to the chiefs, he could persuade them to come, and being dismissed for this purpose, he was as good as his word, for he soon returned accompanied by several of them. Cortes first asked the cause of the change in their behavior. He then demanded an immediate supply of provisions, and also a number of their people for the milking day, to convey the baggage and artillery. The chiefs appeared confounded, but at length promised to send in provisions, though they said he had not been forbidden by Montezuma, that he was not satisfied we should go any farther. Just at this time, 3 of our friends from Sempoal called out to the general, and informed him that they had discovered hard by our quarters pitfalls covered with wood and earth, and that clearing away the earth and looking into them, they had found it set with sharp stakes, that the terraces of all the houses were filled with stones and parapeted with sods, and they had seen a barricade of strong timber in one of the streets. At this instant arrived also 8 Tlascalans from their army which was lying in the old. They warned Cortes against the intended attack, for it had come to their knowledge that the people of the place had, on the preceding night, sacrificed to their war god 7 victims, 5 of whom were children, and they had also observed that they were withdrawing their women, children, and effects from the place. Hereupon Cortes sent orders to the Tlascalans to hold themselves in readiness, and rejoining the chiefs and priests of the town, he desired them to be under no apprehension, but warned them not to deviate from their obedience on pain of instant punishment. He then demanded of them 2,000 of their warriors to accompany him on his march the ensuing day. This they readily promised, thinking that it would tend to facilitate their projects. They therefore took their leave very well contented, and sent notice of our intentions to all those concerned with them. Cortes then sent Donna Marina to bring back the 2 priests with whom he had spoken to. In this she succeeded, and Cortes obtained from them the following intelligence. They told him that Montezuma, on our approach to Mexico, had become very unsettled in his mind, sometimes ordering that we should be received with honor, at other times that we should be not permitted to pass, and that having lately consulted his gods, they had declared that here in Cholula we were all to be put to death, or made prisoners, for which purpose he had sent 20,000 of his troops, 1/2 of which number was in the city, and the other concealed half a league from it. That the plan of their attack was settled, and that 20 of us were allotted to be sacrificed to the gods of Cholula. Cortes rewarded them handsomely, and joining strict secrecy, desired them to bring to him all the chiefs that at the time he appointed. He then summoned a council of the ablest and wisest soldiers of his army, some of whom were returning immediately, and others proposed various measures, but at length all agreed in the necessity of severely punishing this treachery as an example to other people. It was therefore determined that we should carry on the appearance of our intended march, preparing our baggage and concealing our other measures, that within the high walls of the courts where we were quartered, punishment should be inflicted upon the Cholulans. With the ambassadors of Montezuma, it was thought it was most prudent to dissemble. We therefore told them of our having discovered the treason of the people who had aspersed Montezuma, being the author of it. And we proposed to them that they have no more intercourse with the inhabitants, but to retire to the apartment of Cortez. They solemnly declared their ignorance of the transaction, and contrary to their inclination, we now put them under a good guard for the night, during which our whole force remained under arms. On this night, the wife of a cacique, an old woman who was acquainted with the plot, came secretly to Donna Marina, whose appearance had attracted her regard, and invited her to her own house as a place of security from the danger which was ready to overwhelm us, making at the same time a proposal to her to accept as a husband her son, the brother of a boy who accompanied her. Donna Marina, with a profusion of thanks, and with her usual acuteness and pretense of mind, agreed to all that she proposed, but that she wanted someone with whom to entrust her effects. She then obtained information of every particular of the business, all of which the old woman informed her she had learned from her husband, who was chief of one of the divisions of the city, was then with his warriors giving directions for their junction with the Mexican forces. She added that she had known it 3 days before in consequence of presents which had been sent from Mexico to the different chiefs, her husband having received at that time a golden drum. Donna Marina, desiring this woman and her son to remain where they were and take care of her effects, hastened to Cortez and informed him of all that had happened, and that the person from whom she had the information was in her apartment, the consequence of which Cortez immediately sent for her, and the woman, on being brought into his presence, confirmed all that she had said to Donna Marina, which exactly agreed with the other information he had received. When day broke, the hurry of the chiefs, priests, and people, and the satisfaction which appeared in their countenances, were as great as if they had already had us in their cages. They brought many more of their warriors to attend to us than we had required, insomuch that the courts, which remain at this day as a memorial of the event, large as they were, could not contain them. We were all prepared for what was to be done. The soldiers, armed with sword and buckler, were placed at the gate of the great court, in order to prevent any one from escaping, and our general was on horseback, attended by a strong guard. When he saw how the people crowded in, he exclaimed, "How anxious are these traitors to feast upon our flesh, but God will disappoint them." He sent directions to the 2 priests who had given the information to go immediately to their houses, and this he did in order to save their lives. Then, causing the rest of the priests and all the chiefs to be brought in, he calmly asked them what was their reason for plotting to destroy us, what we had done, more than require them to abandon their abominable customs, and endeavor to instruct them in the articles of our holy faith, and that for these reasons only they had made preparations to cut us all off. That their evil intentions appeared by their having withdrawn the women from the town, and when we required, they made preparations to cut us all off. They insulted us by sending in wood and water. He said that he knew of the ambuscade that was placed upon the road which they expected us to go, and that the recompense which they intended for our holy and friendly services was to kill and eat us, for which purpose the pots were already boiling, and prepared with salt, pepper, and tomatoes. That if they were determined to attack us, it was better to do it in a manly way, as the Tlascalans did, he added. But he also knew that 20 of us were to be sacrificed to their idols, to whom they had made a propitiatory offering of 7 of their brethren. But the victory the idols had promised them, it was not in their power to give, and the effects of their treason were now ready to fall on their own heads. This being successfully explained to the natives by Donna Marina, they confessed the whole of the charge, and said it was planned entirely by the orders of Montezuma. Cortez replied that such crimes were never suffered to pass without punishment, and he then commanded a musket to be fired, as the signal for slaughter, which was waited for us, who were, as I've related, well prepared, and falling upon the multitude then enclosed within the courts, we executed their punishment on them in a manner that they will ever remember. For a number of them were killed by us instantly, and many afterwards burned alive, very contrary to the expectations they had formed from the promises of their gods. About 6,000 Cholulans were put to death on this occasion. Within 2 hours, our allies, the Tlascalans, arrived and made a desperate slaughter of them in the streets. And as soon as the Cholulans had ceased to make resistance, the former ravaged the city, plundering and making them slaves without our having it in our power to prevent them. And on the day after, when the intelligence had reached Tlaxcala, fresh hordes crowded hither for the same purpose. It was now absolutely necessary to restrain them all at all risks. Cortez therefore ordered the chiefs to withdraw their troops, which they immediately did, And soon after, some priests and chieftains who presided over other parts of the town, which they allegedly not have been engaged in the conspiracy, waited on us and requested a remission of punishment. The two priests formerly mentioned, the old woman who was so anxious to be the mother-in-law of Donna Marina, came also and petitioned to the same effect. Cortez appeared greatly enraged, and calling for the Mexican ambassadors, declared in their presence that if he did not destroy the whole city as it deserved, it was out of respect to the great Montezuma, whose vassals the inhabitants were, but for his sake he pardoned them. He then commanded the Tlascalans to deliver up those whom they had made prisoners. This, however unwillingly, they in a great measure complied with, many persons being set at liberty, but after all they retained a good booty of gold, mantles, cotton, salt, and slaves. An amnesty for the past being proclaimed, and Cortez having been reconciled the Tlascalans and the Cholulans, the latter suggested they were apprehensive our general would appoint their new chief, the former one having been put to death. After this attempted treachery by Montezuma, the army under Cortez head towards the capital of Mexico. Early in the morning, when we were on the point of marching, a sentinel came to inform us that a great number of Mexicans, richly dressed, were upon the road. Cortez therefore ordered us to return to our quarters, and at that instant 4 of the principal courtiers of Mexico arrived, and awaiting on Cortez with great respect informed him that Cacamatzin, lord of Tezcuco, the nephew of the great Montezuma, was approaching, and requested that we would wait to receive him. Cacamatzin followed in the greatest pomp, carried in a magnificent litter adorned with green plumes and enriched with jewels, set in the branched pillars of solid gold. He was borne by 8 lords, who assisted him out of the litter and swept the way by which he was to pass. When he came into the presence of Cortez, he said to him, "Malintzin, here am I and those lords to attend you to your residence in our city, by order of the great Montezuma." Cortez embraced the prince and presented him with 3 jewels of that kind called margaritas, which are figured in different colors. We then sent forward on the road to Mexico, which was crowded with multitudes of the natives, and arrived at the causeway of Iztapalapa, which leads to that capital. When we beheld a number of populous towns on the water and firm ground, and that broad causeway running straight and level to the city, we could compare it to nothing but the enchanted scenes we had read of in Amadis of Gaul, from the great towers and temples, and other edifices of lime and stone which seems to rise out of the water. To many of us it appeared doubtful whether we were asleep or awake, nor was the manner in which I expressed myself to be wondered at, for it must be considered that never yet did man see, hear, or dream of anything equal to the spectacle which appeared before our eyes this day. When we approached Iztapalapa, we were received by several great lords of that country, relations of Montezuma, who conducted us to our lodgings there, in palaces magnificently built of stone and timber, which was cedar, and spacious courts and apartments furnished with canopies of the finest cotton. After having contemplated these noble edifices, we walked through the gardens, which were admirable to behold, from the variety of beautiful and aromatic plants, and the numerous alleys filled with fruit trees, roses, and various flowers. Here also was a lake of the clearest water, which communicated with the Grand Lake of Mexico by a channel cut for the purpose, and capable of admitting the largest canoes. The whole was ornamented with works of art, painted and admirably plastered when whitened, and it was rendered more delightful by numbers of beautiful birds. When I beheld the scenes that were around me, I thought within myself that this was the garden of the world. This place was at the time of which I am speaking, with 1/2 of the houses in the water, and the other half on dry land. But all is destroyed, and that which was a lake is now a tract of fields of Indian corn, so entirely altered that the natives themselves could hardly know it. Mexico, November 8th, 1519. On the next day we set out, accompanied as on the former one, and proceeded by the Grand Causeway, which is 8 yards wide, and runs in a straight line to the city of Mexico. It was crowded with people, as were all the towers, temples, and causeways, in every part of the lake, attracted by curiosity to behold men and animals, such as never had been before seen in these countries. We were occupied by very different thoughts. Our number did not amount to 450. We had perfectly in our recollection the accounts we had received on our march, that we were to be put to death on our arrival in the city which we now saw before us, approachable only by causeways, whereupon were several bridges, breaking of one effectually cut off our retreat. And now let who can tell me where are men in this world to be found except ourselves, who would have hazarded such an attempt. When we arrived at a place where a small causeway turns off, which goes to the city of Coyoacan, we were met by a great number of the lords of the court in their richest dresses, sent as they laid before the great Montezuma to bid us welcome. After waiting there some time, the nephew of Montezuma and other noblemen went back to meet their monarch, who approached, carried in the most magnificent litter, which was supported by his principal nobility. When we came near certain towers which are almost close to the city, Montezuma, who was then there, quitted his litter, and was borne in the arms of the princes of Tezcuco, Itzapalapa, Tacuba, and Cuyocan, under a canopy of the richest materials, ornamented with green feathers, gold, and precious bones that hung in the manner of a fringe. He was most richly dressed and adorned, and wore buskins of pure gold ornamented with jewels. The princes who supported him were dressed in rich habits, different from those in which they came to meet us, and others who preceded the monarch spread mantles on the ground lest his feet should touch it. All who attended him, except 4 princes, kept their eyes fixed upon the earth, not daring to look him in the face. When Cortes met the great Montezuma, he dismounted from his horse and advanced towards him with much respect. Montezuma bid him welcome, and Cortes replied with a compliment, and it appeared to me that he offered to yield the right hand of Montezuma, who declined it, and put Cortes on his right. Our general then produced a collar of those artificial jewels called margaritas, which are of various colors, set in gold, and threw it upon the neck of Montezuma, after which he advanced to embrace him. But the lords who surrounded the monarch, taking him by the arm, prevented him, it appearing to them not sufficiently respectful. Cortes then said that he rejoiced in having seen so great a monarch, that he was highly honored by his coming out to meet him, as well as by the many other marks of his favor. To this Montezuma made a gracious reply, and gave orders to the princes of Tezcuco, Coco, and Coyocan to attend us to our quarters. Attended by his nobility, we then returned to the city, all the people standing close to the walls, without daring to lift up their eyes, and thus we piled without obstruction from the crowd. Who could count the multitude of men, women, and children which thronged the streets, canals, and terraces, and tops of the houses on that day? The whole of what I saw on this occasion is so strongly imprinted upon my memory that it appears to me if it had happened only yesterday. Glory to our Lord Jesus Christ, who gave us courage to venture upon such dangers, and brought us safely through them. And praise be He, that He has suffered me to live, to write this my true history, although not fully and satisfactorily as the subject deserves. Our lodgings were provided in the buildings which had been inhabited by the father of Montezuma. Here the monarch had the temples of his gods, and a secret treasure of gold and valuables, which he had derived from his father Axayacca. We were lodged here because, being considered as tules, they thought we were in our proper place among the idols. Be it how it may, however, that here they brought us to lodge in large apartments, a real platform being assigned for our general, and mats for each of us, with little canopies over them, such as are used in that country. The whole of this palace was very light, airy, clean, and pleasant, the entry being through a great court. Montezuma here led Cortes by the hand to the apartment destined for him, and taking a large collar of gold, placed it around the general's neck. Cortes declared his gratitude for these favors, and Montezuma said, "Melanson, here you and your friends are at home. Now repose yourselves." With these words he departed. We were allotted to our quarters by companies. Our artillery was posted in a convenient place, and all was arranged in such a manner as to be prepared for any contingency. A very sumptuous entertainment was provided for us, which we sat down to be with great satisfaction. And here ends the true and full account of our adventurous and magnanimous entry into Mexico on the 8th day of November in the year of our Lord 1519. Glory be to Jesus Christ for all. When the great Montezuma had made his repast, and understood that we had done the same, attended by a great body of his nobility, he came to our apartments. Cortes went out to the middle of the hall to receive him, where Montezuma took him by the hand, and seats richly ornamented being brought, they both sat down, by the desire of the king, who then began a very pertinent speech, wherein he observed that he rejoiced to have in his dominions captains so brave as Cortes and his associates, and that he had before heard of one who had arrived at Champoton, and also of another who had come with 4 ships in the preceding year, that he had been anxious to see them, but had been disappointed. Now, however, that we were arrived, he was happy to offer us all the favor he had in his power to bestow, for we were undoubtedly those who had been mentioned by his ancestors, who had predicted that there would come certain men from that part where the sun rises, to govern these countries. It could be no other but us, who had fought so valiantly since our arrival in their country, a representation of each of our battles having been sent to him. Cortes replied that he and all of us could never repay the great favors we every day received from his hands, that we certainly were those of whom it had been prophesied, and that we were vassals of a potent monarch named Don Carlos, who had many great princes subject to him, and sent us, hearing of the fame and grandeur of King Montezuma, to request his name, that the great Montezuma and his subjects would embrace the holy Christian faith, which is the faith possessed by our monarch, by doing which he would preserve the souls of him, his family, and his subjects, and that he should in good time be informed of more particulars, such as that we worship the only true God, with many other things highly edifying to the hearers. This conversation being concluded, Montezuma presented our general with a quantity of valuable ornaments of wrought gold. To each of the captains he made a present of some gold and 3 loads of mantles, to each soldier 2 loads of richly wrought mantles. And all this he did in the most free and gracious manner, to speak more properly like a great monarch as he was. Montezuma then asked Cortez if his soldiers were all brothers and vassals of our emperor, to which Cortez replied that we were all brothers in love and friendship, persons of consequence in our country, and servants of our sovereign lord the king. With mutual compliments, Montezuma then departed, having given orders to his officers to provide us amply, according to our demands, with corn, stone mills, and women to make bread, together with fowls, fruit, and plenty of grass for the horses. The great Montezuma was at this time aged about 40 years, of good nature, well proportioned and thin. His complexion was much fairer than that of the Indians. He wore his hair short, just covering his ears, with very little beard, well arranged, thin, and black. His face was rather long, with a pleasant countenance, and good eyes. Gravity and good humor were blended together when he spoke. He was very delicate and clean in his person, bathing himself every evening. He had a number of mistresses of the first families, and 2 princesses his lawful wives. When he visited them, it was with such secrecy that none could know except his own servants. He was clear of all suspicion of unnatural vices. The clothes which he wore one day he did not put on for 4 days after. He had 200 of his nobility as a guard, in apartments adjoining his own. Of there, certain persons only could speak to him, and when they went to wait upon him, they took off their rich mantles and put on others of less ornament but clean. They entered his apartment barefooted, their eyes fixed on the ground, making 3 inclinations of the body as they approached him. In addressing the king, they said, "Lord, my lord, great lord." When they had finished, he dismissed them with a few words, and they retired, with their faces towards him, with their eyes fixed upon the ground. I also observed that when great men came a distance about business, they entered his palace barefooted and in a plain habit. And also they did not enter the gate directly, but took a circuit and headed towards it. His cooks had upwards of 30 different ways of dressing meats, and they had earthen vessels so contrived as to keep them always hot. For the table of Montezuma himself, above 300 dishes were dressed, and for his guards above 1,000. Before dinner, Montezuma would sometimes go out and inspect the preparations, and his officers would point out to him which were the best, and explain of what birds and flesh they were composed, and those of what he would eat. But this was more for amusement than anything else. It is said that at times the flesh of young children was dressed for him, but the ordinary meats were domestic fowls, pheasants, geese, partridges, quails, venison, Indian hogs, pigeons, hares, rabbits, with many other animals and birds peculiar to the country. This is certain, that after Cortez had spoke to him relative to the dressing of human flesh, it was not practiced in his palace. At his meals, in the cold weather, a number of torches of the bark of a wood which makes no smoke and has an aromatic smell were lighted, that they should not throw too much heat. Screens ornamented with gold, painted with figures of idols, were placed before them. Montezuma was seated on a low throne or chair at a table proportioned to the height of his seat. The table was covered with white cloths and napkins, and 4 beautiful women presented him with water for his hands, in vessels which they called chicales, and other vessels under them like plates, to catch the water. They also presented him with towels. Then 2 other women brought small cakes of bread, and when the king began to eat, a large screen of wood gilt was placed before him, so that people should not during that time see him. The women having retired a little distance, 4 ancient lords stood by the throne, to whom Montezuma from time to time spoke or addressed questions, and as a mark of particular favor, gave to each of them a plate of that which he was eating. I was told that these old lords, who were his near relations, were also counselors and judges. The plates which Montezuma presented to them they received with the highest respect, eating what was in them without taking their eyes off the ground. He was served on earthenware of Cholula, red and black. While the king was at table, none of his guards or in the vicinity of his apartment dared for their lives make any noise. Fruit from all kinds of that the country produced was laid before him. He ate very little, but from time to time a liquor prepared from cocoa and of a stimulative or corroborative quality, as we were told, was presented to him in golden cups. We could not at that time see if he drank it or not, but I observed a number of jars above 50 brought in, filled with foaming chocolate, which he took some, which the women presented to him. At different intervals during the time of dinner there entered certain Indians, humpbacked, very deformed, and ugly, who played tricks of buffoonery, and others who said they were jesters. There was also a company of singers and dancers who afforded Montezuma much entertainment. To these he ordered the vases of chocolate be distributed. The 4 female attendants then took away the claws, and again with much respect presented him with water to wash his hands, during which time Montezuma conversed with the 4 old noblemen formerly mentioned, after which they took their leave with many ceremonies. One thing I forgot, and no wonder to mention in its place, that during the time Montezuma sat at dinner, 2 very beautiful women were busily employed making small cakes with eggs and other things mixed therein. These were delicately white, and when they were presented to him on plates covered with napkins. Also another kind of bread was brought to him in long loaves, and plates of cakes resembling wafers. After he had dined, he presented with him 3 little canes highly ornamented, containing liquid amber, mixed with an herb they called tobacco. And when he had sufficiently viewed and heard the singers, dancers, and buffoons, he took a little of the smoke of one of these canes, and then laid himself down to sleep. And thus his principal meal concluded. After this was over, all of his guards and domestics sat down to dinner. As near as I could judge, above 1,000 plates of those eatables I have mentioned were laid before them, with vessels foaming of chocolate, of fruit in immense quality. For his women and inferior servants, his establishment was of a prodigious expense. We were astonished amidst such a profusion of the vast regularity that prevailed. His major domo was at this time a prince named Tapia. He kept the accounts of Montezuma's rents in books which accompanied an entire house. Montezuma had 2 buildings filled with every kind of arms, richly ornamented with gold and jewels, such as shields large and small, clubs like 2-handed swords, and lances much larger than ours, with blades 6 feet in length, so strong that if they fix upon a shield they do not break, and sharp enough to use as razors. There was also an immense quantity of bows and arrows and darts, together with slings and shields rolled up into small compass, and in action they let fall and are therefore cover the whole body. He also had much defensive armor, of quilted cotton, ornamented with feathers and different devices, and cassockets for the head, made of wood and bone, with plumes of feathers, and many other articles too tedious to mention. In this palace was the most magnificent aviary, which contained every description of birds that continent afforded, namely royal eagles and a smaller species, and with many other birds, down to the smallest paroquets of beautiful colors. It was here that the ornaments of green feathers were fabricated. The feathers were taken from birds which are about the size of our pies in Spain, which they here called quetzales, and other birds whose plumage is of 5 different colors: green, red, white, yellow, and blue. The name of this species of bird I do not know. Here was an immensity of parrots and certain geese of fine plumage, and the species which resembled geese. All these bred here, and were stripped of their feathers every year at the proper season. Here was a large pond of clear running water, where a number of great birds, entirely red, with very long legs. There are some like them in the island of Cuba, which they called epiris. There was also a species which lives entirely in the water. We likewise saw another great building, which was a temple, and which contained those which we called the valiant or fighting gods. And here were many kinds of furious beasts, tigers, lions of 2 species, one of which resembles a wolf, called here a div, also foxes and other smaller animals, but all carnivorous. Most of these were bred in the palace, being fed with game, fowls, dogs, as I have heard the bodies of Indians who were sacrificed, the manner of which I have been informed this is. They open the body of the victim while living, with large knives of stone, and they take out his heart and blood, which they offer to their gods. Then they cut off the limbs and the head, upon which they feast, giving the body to be devoured by the wild beasts, and the skulls they hang up in their temples. In this accursed place were many vipers and poisonous serpents, which have in their tails somewhat the sounds of castanets. These are the most dangerous of all, and were kept in vessels filled with feathers, where they reared their young, and were fed with the flesh of human beings and dogs. And I have been allured that after our expulsion from Mexico, all these animals lived for many days upon the bodies of our comrades who were killed on that occasion. These beasts and horrid reptiles were retained to keep company with their infernal gods, and when these animals yelled and hissed, the palace seemed like hell itself. The place where the artist principally resided was named Escapuzalco, and was at the distance about a league from the city. Here were the shops and manufactories of all their gold and silversmiths, whose works in these metals and in jewelry, when they were brought to Spain, surprised our ablest artists. Their painters we may also judge of by what we now see, for there are 3 Indians in Mexico, who are named Marcos de Aquino, Juan de la Cruz, and Crespilo, who, if they had lived with the Apelles in ancient times, were compared with Michelangelo or Borgante in modern times, and would not be held inferior to them. When we had been 4 days in Mexico, Cortes wished to take a view of the city, and in consequence went to request the permission of His Majesty. Accordingly, Aguilar, Donna Marina, and a little page of our generals called Orteguilla had already understood something of the language, went to the palace for that purpose. Montezuma was pleased immediately to accede, but being apprehensive that we might offer some insult to his temple, he determined to go thither in person, which he did accordingly, in same form and with the same retinue as when he first came out to meet us, but that he was on this occasion preceded by 2 lords bearing scepters in their hands, which they carried on high, as the signal of the king's approach. Montezuma in his litter, with a small rod in his hand, one half of which was gold, the other half wood, which he bore elevated like a rod of justice, for such it was, approached the temple, and there quitted his litter and mounted the steps, attended by a number of priests, offering incense with many ceremonies to his war gods. Cortes, at the head of his cavalry and the principal part of our soldiers under arms, marched to the grand square, attended by many noblemen of the court. When we arrived there, we were astonished at the crowds of people and the regularity which prevailed, as well as the vast quantities of merchandise which those who attended us were assiduous in pointing out. Each kind had its particular place, which was distinguished by a sign. The articles consisted of gold, silver, jewels, feathers, mantles, chocolate, skins dressed and undressed, sandals, and other manufactures of the roots and fibers of neckweed, and great numbers of male and female slaves, some of which were fastened by the neck in collars to long poles. The meat market was stocked with fowl, game, and dogs. Vegetables, fruits, articles of food, ready dressed, salt, bread, honey, and sweet pastry, and made in various ways, were also sold there. Other places in the square were appointed to the sake of earthenware, where wooden household furniture, stuck tables, benches, firewood paper, sweet canes filled with tobacco, mixed with liquid amber, copper axes and working tools, and wooden vessels highly painted. Numbers of women sold fish and little loaves made of a certain mud which they find in the lake, which resembles cheese. The makers of stone blades were busily employed shaping them out of rough material, and the merchants who dealt in gold had the metal in grains as it came from the mines, in transparent tubes so that they could be reckoned, and the gold was valued at many mantles, or so many ziquipils of cocoa, according to the size of the quills. The entire square was enclosed in piazzas, under which great quantities of grain were stored, and were also shops of various kinds of goods. I must apologize for adding that boatloads of human waste were on the borders of the adjoining canals for the purpose of tanning leather, which they said could not be done without it. Some may laugh at this, but I assert the fact as I've stated, and moreover, upon all the public roads, places for passengers to resort to were built of canes thatched with straw or grass, in order to collect this material. From the square we proceeded to the great temple, but before we entered it we made a circuit through a number of large courts, the smallest of which appeared to me to contain more ground than the great square in Salamanca, with double enclosures built of lime and stone, and the courts paved with a large white cut stone, very clean, or where not paved, they were plastered and polished. When we approached the gate of the great temple, to the flat summit of which the ascent was by 114 steps, and before we had mounted one of them, Montezuma sent down to us 6 priests and 2 of his noblemen to carry Cortes up, as they had done their sovereign, which he politely declined. When we ascended to the summit of the temple, we observed on the platform as we passed the large stones upon which were placed the victims who were to be sacrificed. Here was a great figure which resembled a dragon, and much blood, fresh spilt. Montezuma came out from an auditory in which his accursed idols were placed, and attended by 2 priests, and addressing himself to Cortes, expressed his apprehensions that he was fatigued, to which Cortes replied that fatigue was unknown to us. Montezuma then took him by the hand and pointed out to him the different parts of the city and its vicinity, all of which were commanded from that place. Here we had a clear prospect of the 3 causeways by which Mexico communicated with the land, and of the aqueduct of the Chapultepec, which was supplied the city with the finest water. We were struck by the numbers of canoes passing to and from the mainland, loaded with provisions and merchandise, and we could now perceive in this great city that all others of that neighborhood which were built on the water, the houses stood separate from each other, communicating only by small drawbridges and by boats, and they were built with terraced tops. We observed also the temples and adoratories of the adjacent cities, built in the form of towers and fortresses, and others on the causeway, all whitewashed and wonderfully brilliant. The noise and bustle of the marketplace below us could be heard almost a league off, and those who had been at Rome and Constantinople said that for convenience, regularity, and population they had never seen the like. Cortes, then addressing himself to Montezuma, requested that he would do him the favor to show us his gods. Montezuma, having first consulted his priests, led us into a tower where there was a kind of a saloon. Here there were 2 altars highly adorned with richly wrought timbers on the roof, and over the altars gigantic figures resembling very fat men. The one on the right was Huitzilopochtli, their war god, with a great face and terrible eyes. This figure was entirely covered with golden jewels, and his body bound with golden serpents. In his right hand he held a bow, in his left a bundle of arrows. The little idol which stood by him represented his page, and bore a lance and target richly ornamented with gold and jewels. The great idol had round his neck the figures of human heads and hearts, made of pure gold and silver, ornamented with precious stones of a blue color. Before the idol was a pan of incense, with 3 hearts of human victims, which they were then burning, mixed with copal. The whole of that apartment, both the walls and the floor, was stained with human blood in such quantity as to give a very offensive smell. On the left was another great figure, with a countenance like a bear, and great shining eyes, of the polished substance whereof their mirrors are made. The body of this idol was also covered with jewels. These 2 deities, it was said, were brothers. The name of this last was Tezcatlipoca, and he was the god of the infernal regions. He presided, according to their notions, over the souls of men. His body was covered with figures representing little devils with tails of serpents, and the walls and pavement of this temple were so besmeared with blood that they stunk worse than all the slaughterhouses of Castile. An offering lay before him of 5 human hearts. In the summit of the temple, in a recess the timber of which was the most highly ornamented, we saw a figure half human and half resembling an alligator, inlaid with jewels and partially covered with a mantle. This idol was said to contain the germ, the origin of all created things, and was the god of the harvest and fruits. The walls and altars were bestained like the rest, and so offensive that we thought we could never get out soon enough. In this place they had a drum of the most enormous size, the head of which was made of the skins of large serpents. The instrument, when struck, resounded with a noise that could be heard to the distance of 2 leagues, and so doleful was it that it deserved to be named the music of the infernal regions. And with their horrible-sounding horns and trumpets, their great knives for sacrifice, their human victims, and their blood-besprinkled altars, I devoted them and all their wickedness to God's vengeance, and thought the time would never arrive that I should escape from this scene of human butchery, horrible smells, and more detestable sights. Cortes, half in jest, addressing himself to Montezuma, expressed his wonders that so wise a prince could worship so absurd and wicked powers, and proposed to him to place on the summit of that tower a cross, and in those adoratories the image of the Holy Virgin, and he assured him that he would then be soon convinced of the vanity and deception of his idols. Montezuma shooed off marks of displeasure at these expressions, saying that he would not have admitted us to the temple had he thought that we would have insulted their gods, who were kind to them, who gave them health and seasonable rains, good harvests, fine weather, victories, and whatever else they desired, and whom they were in duty and in gratitude bound to worship. Cortes dropped the discourse, observing that it was time for us to go, and Montezuma, assenting, said it was necessary for him to remain to expiate by sacrifice the sin which he had committed in admitting us there. Cortes then took leave, and thus we concluded our visit to the great temple of Mexico, descending the steps with much pain to our invalid suffering by the disease ascribed to Hispaniola. Bernal Diaz continues, quote, I will now proceed to relate other matters in which, if I am not so correct as I ought to be, let it be remembered that my situation was that of a soldier who is obliged to be more attentive to the orders of his officer than to the objects of curiosity around him. The ground whereupon this temple stood was as much as 6 of the largest buildings of this country occupy. From the base it diminished to the summit, whereupon was a tower in which the idols were placed, and from the middle of the ascent to the top were 5 concavities like barbicans, but without parapets. However, there are many paintings of temples in the possession of the conquerors, one of whereof I have, and those who have seen them will easily form an idea of the outside of this temple. I have heard that at the time they laid the foundations of it, the natives of that country all made offerings of their gold, silver, and jewels, of the seeds of the earth, and of the prisoners, all of which were buried in the foundations of the building. The inquisitive reader will naturally ask how I came to know anything of this plan, which happened upwards of 1,000 years ago. I will inform him. When we got possession of this great city, and that it was to be built upon a new plan, it was determined to place the church of St. Iago on the ground where this temple stood, and in sinking the foundations we found great quantities of gold, silver, and other valuables, and a Mexican who obtained part of the same ground discovered more treasure, about which there was a lawsuit in support of His Majesty's right, the result of which I am ignorant of. The account was also confirmed by Guatemotzin, who was then alive, and who said that the transaction was recorded in their ancient historical paintings. The church which now stands here is called St. Iago y Tlatuelco. This temple, I have before observed, was surrounded by courts as large as the square of Salamanca, inside of a double enclosure of lime and stone. At a little distance from it stood a tower, a true hell or habitation for demons, with a mouth resembling that of an enormous monster, wide open and ready as it were to devour those who entered. At the door stood frightful idols, and by it was a place for sacrifice, and within boilers and pots full of water to dress the flesh of the victims, which was eaten by the priests. The idols were like serpents and devils, and before them were tables and knives for sacrifice, the place being covered with the blood which was spilt on those occasions. The furniture was like that of a butcher stall, and I never give this accursed building any name except that of hell. Having passed this, we saw great piles of wood and a reservoir of water supplied by a pipe from the great aqueduct. And crossing a court, we came to another temple, wherein were the tombs of Mexican nobility. It was begrimed with soot and blood. Next to this was another full of skeletons and piles of bones, each kept apart, but regularly arranged. In each temple were idols, and in each had its also particular priests, who wore long vestments of black, somewhat between the dress of the Dominicans and our canons. Their long hair was clotted together, and their ears lacerated in honor of their gods. At a certain distance from the buildings of which I had last spoken were others, the idols of which were, as they lay, the advocates or superintendent deities of human marriages, and all round the great court were many houses, which were not very lofty, and wherein resided the priests, and others who had charge of the idols. Here was also a great reservoir of water, supplied with pipes exclusively for the service of the two idols, Huitzilopotli and Tacataputa, and hard by a large building were a number of young Mexican women who resided there as in a nunnery until they were married. They worshipped two female deities who presided over marriages, and to them they offered sacrifices in order to obtain good husbands. I have been thus diffuse in my description of the great temple, because it was the most considerable in that city, amongst the many sumptuous buildings of that kind which it contained. The temple of Cholula, however, was higher than this, having 120 steps. It was also held in great veneration, and was built upon a plan different from that of Mexico. The temple at Texcoco was very large, having 117 steps. All of these were different structures, but agreed in having a number of outer courts and a double enclosure. One ridiculous circumstance is that in each province had their own particular gods who were supposed to have no concern of any other, so that the idols were innumerable in this country. Having fatigued ourselves with the examination of these scenes, so new to us, we retired to our quarters. Cortez, perceiving how adverse the king was to the conversion of his temple into a Christian church, applied to one of the principal officers of his palace for materials to construct a chapel and altar within our quarters. His desire being made known to Montezuma, it was instantly complied with, and timber and workmen being provided, in 3 days we had it completed. Here we said Mass every day. We had, however, to lament the total want of wine for the Holy Sacrament, it having been all used in the illness of Cortez, the Reverend Father, and others during the wars in Tlaxcala. However, we were constant in our devotions, as well on account of our duty, as in order to impress a proper ideal of our holy religion on the minds of Montezuma and the natives. Being employed in looking out for a proper place to fix the Holy Cross, one of our carpenters observed an appearance on the wall, as if a door had been there, and lately closed up. When this was made known to Cortez, it was privately opened, and upon entering the apartment they found riches without end. The secret soon transpired, and we went, all of us, to view them. I was then a young man, and I thought that if all the treasures of the earth had been brought into one place, they could not have amounted to so much. It was agreed again to close up the door, and we had determined to conceal the knowledge of it until the proper time should offer. All right, that was part 2 of the True History of the Conquest of Mexico by Bernal Diaz del Castillo. It was published sometime in the early 16th century. These scenes took place in 1519 in the city of what was formerly the Aztec Empire. So it looks like I'll have to do a part 3, which will probably conclude it, but thanks for listening. Have a good night. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to part 3 of The Conquest of New Spain by Bernal Diaz del Castillo. I left off part 2 at the moment where Cortez is staying in the main city of the Aztecs at Tenochtitlan. We return to the narrative at the point where Cortez decides to take Moctezuma, the head of the Aztecs, hostage. Quote, "A council was now called, composed of Cortez as president, with 4 captains and 12 soldiers, whereof I was one, and having duly considered how evidently the Lord guided us, and what wise and valiant captains and brave soldiers we had, and also the fickle disposition of the Indians, who though now kind of to us might change, there was no laying how soon, and that notwithstanding the hospitality with which Montezuma treated us, he might at any moment fall into an opposite line of conduct, we resolved to follow the opinion of Cortez by adopting the most effectual measure, which was to seize and make that monarch our prisoner. As we could not know at what moment we might be perhaps poisoned in our food, and as no gift of his nor all his father's treasure could make compensation to us for the alarms and distressing thoughts which filled the minds of those of any reflection. For these reasons it was therefore agreed to adopt the measure without delay. The captains who were present proposed that Montezuma should be induced by a plausible pretext to come into our quarters, and when there to seize him, and if he resisted, to make his person answer it. And they urged that of the two great dangers, this was much the least. It was then observed by some of our soldiers that Montezuma's officers did not provide us so plentifully as first, and two of our Talascan allies had told our interpreter, Aguilar, in confidence, that they observed a bad disposition on the part of the Mexicans toward us for the last 2 days. This debate lasted a full hour. At length it was agreed to adjourn until the next day, and in the meantime we insulted our Reverend Father of the Order of Mercy, praying to God to guide us in this difficulty. On the day after this debate arrived 2 Indians of Tlascala very secretly, with letters from Villamica, whereby we were informed that Juan de Escalante had fallen, together with 6 soldiers, in the battle with the Mexicans, and that the inhabitants of the mountains and of Sempoal were in commotion, and refused to supply provisions or to work, so that the garrison knew not what to do. These letters added that the opinion of the Indians were much altered since they found that the Spaniards could be killed like other men. God knows this intelligence afflicted us. It was the first defeat that we had experienced since we landed on that continent, and here let the reflecting reader ponder upon the changes which fate makes in the affairs of men. We who yesterday were honored by Montezuma in possession of wealth and considered invulnerable like demigods, today found ourselves lowered in the consideration of the natives to a level with them in whose power we were. We now therefore saw in a stronger point of view than ever how necessary it was for our very existence to seize Montezuma, and that if we failed, we might as well perish in the attempt as meet our certain fate in any other way. But before I go farther, I will give an account of the misfortune which befell Juan de Escalante. I have already related that in a town named Quiabuistlan, about 30 chiefs of the neighboring districts had voluntarily come under our own government. A Mexican garrison, it appears, attempted to levy contributions upon some of these people. When this was represented to Escalante, the commandant in Villa Rica, he sent word to the officers of Montezuma to desist, threatening them in case they did not, but at the same time expressing his wishes to be on friendly terms with them. To this an abrupt reply was returned, that he should find them in the field. Escalante was a man who had blood in his eye, and on receiving the answer he immediately prepared 40 of his own people and 2,000 of his allies, and put himself in a march against the Mexicans, whom he met out upon a pillaging expedition and attacked. Our allies, who were always afraid of the Mexicans, fled at the first shower of arrows, and left the poor Spaniards to get out of the business as well as they could. With great difficulty they arrived in Almeria, where Escalante and 6 soldiers soon died of their wounds. One soldier they took alive. His name was Arguello, a native of Leon. This man had a large head and a thick curled beard, and was great bodily strength. Such is the truth of the affair at Almeria, which is entirely different from the account of the historian Gomara, where he lays that Pedro de Ircio went to colonize Panuco with a party of soldiers at a time when we had not a sufficiency of men to keep up our guards. In many things which that historian relates concerning the seizure of Montezuma, he ought to have recollected that eyewitnesses to that transaction were yet alive to contradict him. The Mexican captains reported the affair to Montezuma, and presented him with the head of the Spanish soldier, who died of his wounds, as they were bringing him prisoner. It is said that Montezuma trembled when he beheld it, and ordered it to be sent elsewhere. He asked his captains why, being so numerous, they had not conquered such a handful of men. They replied that the reason was because they beheld a supernatural being who encouraged the Spaniards and struck terror into their people, and this Montezuma believed could be no other than the Holy Virgin Mary, with her son in her arms, as we had explained to him that she was our patroness. This I cannot testify to, not having been there myself, but some of those who were there assured me the truth of it, which was the universal belief amongst us. Would to God that it were so. Certain, however, it is that the divine mercy which was with us throughout, for which praised be God. It having been decided that we should seize the person of the king, we passed the whole of the preceding night in praying to our Lord, that he would be pleased to guide us, so that we were about to do would redound to his holy service. And in the morning, 8 days after the arrival of the Spaniards in Mexico, we proceeded to arrange the manner in which our determination was to be carried into effect. Our cavalry and infantry were as usual in readiness to turn, but if called upon, and as it was always our custom to go fully armed, the appearance in that manner gave no suspicion. Cortes, having left our whole force in readiness, proceeded to the palace, attended by the captains Alvarado, Gonzalo de Sandoval, de Leon, de Lugo, de Avila, with the interpreters Donna Marina and Aguilar, sending before him to acquaint the king that he was on his way to pay him a visit. This he did in order to prevent any effect arising from an unexpected appearance. The king concluded that it was on account of the affair of Almeria that Cortez was enraged about that which in reality he did not care the value of a chestnut for, and sent word back to Cortez that he was welcome. Accordingly, our general, and we who attended him, having entered into the presence of Montezuma after paying him his respects, he addressed the king through his interpreter, saying he was astonished that a monarch who was so brave, who had shown himself so friendly to us, should have given orders to his troops in Tuzopan to attack the Spaniards, kill one of them and his horse, and pillage and destroy our allies. Cortez wished to conceal the death of Escalante and the 6 others. He then charged the king with the treacherous attempt against us in Cholula, which he said he had hitherto been deterred from speaking of, by motives of esteem and regard, but that now, in addition to those provocations, his officers were plotting our immediate destruction, and he concluded by saying that in order to prevent the ruin of the city, it was necessary that his majesty should, peaceably, and without making any opposition or remonstrance, immediately go with us to our quarters, where he should be treated with the greatest respect, but that if he said one word or gave at least alarm, the 5 captains then present would instantly put him to death. On hearing this, Montezuma was at first so terrified that he appeared to have lost all sensation. Having recovered himself a little, he denied his ever giving any order of his troops to attack our countrymen, and taking from his wrist the signet of Huitzilopochtli, with which he was used to confirm any order of great importance, he caused the officer of whom complaint had been made to be sent for. He then replied to the proposal of leaving his palace, and summoning up his dignity, said that he was not the person to be forced to take such a step contrary to his inclination. The conversation was prolonged, Cortez giving him good reasons for what he proposed, and the king replying to him with better, insomuch that above a half an hour had now elapsed. The captains who were standing by began at last to grow very impatient, and De Leon cried out to Cortez in his rough voice, "Why, sir, do you waste so many words? Let him yield himself to our prisoner, or we will this instant plunge our swords into his body. Tell him this, and also, that if he says a word, he dies for it. Better for us to allure our lives now, or perish at once." The manner in which this was spoken struck the king, and he asked Donna Marina the meaning of it. She, with her usual readiness, answered by requesting that he would immediately consent to what was proposed to him, and go where he should meet all respect and honor. If she perceived that he hesitated, they were resolved to put him to instant death. He then addressed Cortez and said, "I have a legitimate son and 2 legitimate daughters. Take them as hostages for me, but do not expose me as a prisoner to my own people." Cortez, however, replied, saying nothing but what was originally proposed could do, and that remonstrances were unavailing. At length he was forced to consent, upon which our captains addressed him with every declaration of esteem and respect, earnestly desiring that he would not be offended at what had passed, and that he would tell his officers and guards that he went by his own free will, and by the advice of his gods and priests. This magnificent litters were now brought, and attended by his usual guards, he proceeded to our quarters, where our post and sentinels being duly placed, he was received and entertained with every mark of respect. He was soon waited on by the princes of his family and the chief nobility of Mexico, who came to know the cause of the step that he had taken, and also if it was his wish that they should attack us. But he replied that it was his intention to stay with us for a few days, and that whatever further commands he had for them, he would signify in due time, but charge them with nothing to disturb the city. Thus was the seizure of the great Montezuma effected. He was attended while he was with us in the same manner as his own palace. His wives, family, and officers were with him, and he bathed every day. He appeared calm and resigned, and had always in his presence 20 counselors or chiefs. Ambassadors came to him on affairs of importance from distant countries, to either deliver tribute or with business which he had dispatched. I recollect that however great the prince or chief might be, before he entered the king's presence he took off his rich dress, and put on a plain one of the coarse manufacture of Nequin, and in this habit, and barefooted, approached the royal apartments, which he entered, not directly, but by making a circuit by the wall, and having come, with his eyes cast down upon the ground, into the presence of the king, he made 3 profound bows, and addressed him, calling him Lord, my Lord, great Lord. He then displayed before him a cloth whereon was painted and represented the business on which he came, the particulars of which he pointed out to him with little rods or wands, delicately wrought and polished. During this time 2 old lords stood by the king, and as soon as they attentively considered with all the particulars, they gave their opinions upon it to Montezuma, who dispatched the affair with a few words. The person who had brought it then, without making any reply, withdrew from the king's presence, making 3 profound bows, and keeping his face toward the throne till out of sight. And as soon as he was out of the royal apartments, he put on his rich dress and walked about the city. The messengers who, as it had been mentioned, were dispatched with the royal signet to arrest and bring to Mexico the officers of whom our general had complained, soon returned with them. Upon their arrival, and being brought into the monarch's presence, I do not know what passed, but he immediately sent them to Cortez to do with them as he thought fit. Being examined when the king was not by, they avowed all that had happened, and said that they did it by the orders of Montezuma, which were, that if should it be necessary recur to force, to obtain the tribute due, and attack the Spaniards if they appeared in support of his refractory subjects. Montezuma being charged by Cortes with this, which now appeared, he endeavored to exculpate himself as well as he could. But Cortes told him that although his participation in the guilt of his officers was evident, and although the orders of our monarch were to punish with death all who inflicted death, yet such was his regard for him that he would sooner lose his own life than do his majesty an injury. All these assurances, however, could not remove the fears of Montezuma. As to the officers, Cortes sentenced them to be burnt alive in front of the palace of their king. This was immediately proceeded upon during the time of its taking place, and in order to prevent any impediment occurring, he also ordered that Montezuma should be put in irons. When this was doing, the unfortunate king could no longer suppress his emotions at the indignity, but wept aloud. In this situation he remained until the execution was over, at which time Cortes, attended by his 5 captains, went to his apartment, and with his own hands freed him from the irons, alluring him that he was dearer to him than even a brother, and that he trusted soon to be able to make his dominions exceed double their present extent, and also that if he wished to go to his palace he was at perfect liberty to do so. Montezuma's spirit was now broke, and the tears ran down his cheeks while Cortes was speaking. He declined the offer with thanks, knowing well the emptiness of his words, and added, he considered it most prudent to remain where he was in order to prevent disturbance and insurrection in the city. What we understood, and certainly was the case, was that Cortes had caused the interpreters to say that though he was inclined to release him, the other officers never would allow it. As soon as Montezuma had given his answers, Cortes threw his arms around his neck and protested that he loved him as himself. The king then asked of him his page Orteguilla, a youth who had already learned the language, and Cortes immediately complied with his request, whereupon Orteguilla afterwards remained about the person of the king, a circumstance very useful to both him and to us. Montezuma was very partial to the youth, from whom he was constantly used to inquire particulars relative to Europe, and Orteguilla, from his knowledge of the language, was able to communicate to us whenever he observed, and that was of great importance for us to know. Thus Montezuma remained amongst us, treated with the greatest respect, no officer or soldier or even Cortes himself coming into his pretense or passing him without pulling off his helmet, as he always treated us most kindly and courteously. The officers of Montezuma were publicly executed, as I have related, were 4 in number. Their names were Quetzalpopoca, who was the principal, Coatl, Quiabuitli, and another whom I have forgotten, nor is it of much importance. As soon as this chastisement was known throughout the different provinces of New Spain, it struck universal terror, and the people on the coast returned to their submission. Now let the curious consider upon our heroic actions. First, in destroying our ships and therewith all hope of retreat. Secondly, in entering the capital of Mexico after the alarming warnings that we had received. Thirdly, in daring to make prisoner the great Montezuma, king of all that country, and putting the king in irons during the execution. Now that I am old, I frequently revolve and reflect upon the events of that day, which appear to me as fresh as if they had just paled. Such is the impression they have made upon my mind. I say that it was not we who did these things, but that all was guided by the hand of God, for which men on earth would otherwise have ventured, their numbers not amounting to 450, to have seized and put in irons a mighty monarch, and publicly burned his officers for obeying his orders, in a city larger than Venice, and at a distance of 1,500 leagues from their native country. There is much matter for reflection in this, and it merits to be detailed otherwise than in a dry manner in which I relate it. Cortes now thought it necessary to appoint a commandant at Villarica. For this purpose he chose Alonso de Grado, an indifferent soldier, but a person of good understanding who spoke well and was of a handsome appearance. He was also a musician and an excellent penman. He was always in opposition to Cortes relative to our advance to Mexico, and was the principal orator on those occasions. Cortes, when he gave him the appointment, good-humoredly said to him, "Now, Senor de Grado, go and possess your wishes. You are commandant of Villarica, and see that you fortify it well. And mind, I charge you on no account to go out and fight the wicked Indians, nor let them kill you as they did Juan de Escalante." This Cortes said ironically, knowing the condition of the man, and that all the world could not have got to him to put his nose out of the town. We who were listening to this and perceived his drift could hardly forbear laughing aloud. He then gave him his instructions to behave kindly to his Indian neighbors, and not permit them to be robbed or oppressed. He also desired to cause the smiths who were in that settlement to make 2 large chains out of the old iron of the ships, and send them to him immediately, and lose no time in proceeding with the construction of the wooden fort. When de Grado arrived at his government, he affected to carry on business with a lofty demeanor and sent to the neighboring Indians who were at peace with us, requiring them to give him gold and female slaves, paying no attention whatever to the fortifications, but passing his time in feasting and play. What was worse, he combined with the adherents of Velasquez, offering to put him in possession of the post he was entrusted with. These things being soon communicated to Cortes, he repented for his imprudent step in appointing to such a place a man whose bad disposition he knew well. He also foresaw that Velasquez must sooner or later find out that he had lent agents to Old Castile, and would probably send a force against us. For these reasons, it was necessary that he should have a person of confidence in command at Villarica. Therefore he sent Sandoval, who was now Alguazil Mayor, with whom went Pedro de Irrichio, already mentioned, who gained the confidence of Sandoval, a good-natured man, by diverting him with anecdotes of the families of the Count de Urena and Dom Pedro Giron, which he had served. De Irrichio, by means of this, gained favor so completely that he never ceased promoting him till he had got him the rank of captain, instead of which promotion, for the licenses he gave his tongue, for which Sandoval at times reprehended him, he deserved to have been well punished. Sandoval, on his arrival at Villarica, immediately arrested de Grado and sent him prisoner to Mexico under a guard of Indians, according to the orders of Cortes. The new governor soon made himself very popular among the natives for his affability and humanity, and he immediately began to put the fort into proper repair. Cortes would not see de Grado on his arrival, but confined him to the stocks, where he remained for 2 days. I recollect that the timber whereof these things were made has a strong smell of garlic. De Grado, who was a man of great plausibility, at last made his peace, and was employed, not in a military capacity, but in one conformable to his talents, being given the office of contador, which had been held by Avila, who was sent as pure procurador to the island of St. Domingo. Sandoval had orders to send the ironwork necessary for the construction of 2 vessels, which he punctually executed, and the various articles arrived safely in Mexico. Cortes, regularly every day after Mass, went to wait on Montezuma, attended by all his officers, and asked him what he would be pleased to order that they could execute, to which the king used to answer, thanking him. He found himself perfectly to his satisfaction. Thus, from one subject to another, they usually fell into discourse about our holy faith and the power of our emperor. At other times, Montezuma and Cortes used to play a certain game which they called totoloque, in which they take aim with golden balls at certain objects also made of gold. I remember once in particular when Cortes and Alvarado were playing against Montezuma and his nephew. Montezuma jocularly said that he would not allow Tony Atio, meaning Alvarado, so called on his account of his handsome person, that word meaning the sun, to mark, expressing himself in such a manner as to imply that Alvarado did not say which was true, at which we all burst out laughing, because Alvarado was a little addicted to exaggeration. When Cortes gained, he gave his winnings to those about Montezuma, and when the king gained, he did the same to our soldiers of the guard. Indeed, he never let a day pass without making presents of some kind to all of us, but more particularly to Velasquez de Leon, who was the captain of his guard, and always paid him great attention. One night a soldier named Trujillo was guilty of a certain piece of disrespect within his hearing, at which Montezuma was highly offended, and inquired of the page who the person was. The page told him that he was a man of low birth who knew no better. He then proceeded to tell him of our different ranks and qualities, about which he was very curious. On the next day, he ordered Trujillo to be brought into his presence, and after having reproved him, he made him a present worth about 5 crowns. The words of Montezuma made less impression on the soldier than his gold, and on the next night the fellow was guilty of the same piece of impoliteness in order to get more. Of this Montezuma complained to Velasquez, who ordered the man to be relieved and severely reprimanded him. Another soldier one night complained that he was ill, cursing this dog of an Indian, meaning Montezuma, who gave them so much trouble. This being overheard by the king, who discovered what he had said, he complained thereof to Cortes, by whose command the man was immediately whipped, notwithstanding he was a very good soldier. His name was Pedro Lopez. After this example, strict discipline and silence were kept by the guard, to the great satisfaction of the king, who was very kind to us, knew us all, and spoke to us by our names. I was at this time a stripling, and always behaved to him with great respect. His page had told him that I had been twice upon his coast before the arrival of Cortes, and I desired the page to mention to him that instead of gold or mantles, he would oblige by giving me a handsome Indian girl. This request he graciously complied with, calling me to him, saying, Bernal Diaz del Castillo, the young woman I present to you is the daughter of one of my principal nobility. Treat her well, and her friends will give you gold and mantles, as much as you can desire. I kissed his majesty's hand, thanking him for his favors and praying to God to prosper him, to which Montezuma replied, saying, "It seems to me that Del Castillo is of a noble condition." Wherewith he ordered me 3 plates of gold and 2 loads of mantles. I will now relate some more particulars of his course of life. In the morning, having paid his devotions, he ate a slight breakfast, not of meats but vegetables, such as agi or pepper, and then remained a full hour hearing business in the manner I have already described. The number of judges or counselors who attended upon him at those times amounted to 20. His numerous mistresses he used to marry to his officers and particular friends. Some of them fell to our lot. Mine was called Donna Francisca, a lady of high birth, as she shewed by her manners. Thus, sometimes amusing himself and sometimes meditating on his situation, the great Montezuma passed the days of his confinement amongst us. The materials being arrived, Cortes requested that the king would give him permission to construct 2 vessels for the purpose of amusing himself upon the water, and also that he would order his carpenters to assist. The oak timber was only at the distance of about 4 leagues, and Montezuma having given his consent, the work went on so expeditiously by the number of Indian carpenters, and was so ably conducted by our principal builder, Martin Lopez, that in a very short space of time they were built, launched, and rigged, with an awning over each. Montezuma at this time requested permission from Cortes to pay his devotions and perform sacrifices, in order that his friends and subjects might see that he lived among us by the order of his gods, and his own choice. Cortes returned for answer, and that in doing so, it was his business to beware how he did anything whereby to lose his life. For that he would send a guard of officers and soldiers with him, giving them strict orders to kill him instantly, in case there appeared to be anything like a commotion. With this caution he gave him his permission to visit his temple. It was also at the same time signified to him that no human sacrifice would be permitted, to which Montezuma having agreed, he set out in his usual pomp, and accompanied by 4 of our captains, Velasquez de Leon, Alvarado, Avila, and de Lugo, with 150 soldiers. Our Reverend Father in the Order of Mercy also attended for the purpose of preventing human sacrifice. Montezuma, on his arrival to the temple, came out of his litter and was supported up to it as usual, being met by a number of priests. They had on the preceding night sacrificed 4 Indians, nor could all our endeavors prevent that inhuman practice, which we were for the present obliged to connive at, seeking to do anything which would cause an insurrection. After Montezuma had stayed a short time at his devotions, he came down from the temple and returned to our quarters in great good humor, making presents to all of us who attended him upon the occasion. The vessels were now afloat upon the lake, fully equipped and manned with expert sailors, and they obeyed both sail and oar, so as to answer our utmost expedition. When Montezuma was informed of it, he requested Cortes to permit him to go hunting in a certain district, which was prohibited to all others on pain of death. Cortes assented, warning him that his life paid for the forfeit of any attempt at a rescue, and he offered him the use of his ships to go there, which Montezuma was greatly pleased with and accepted. The swiftest sailing vessel conveyed the king and his suite, and the other was occupied by his son and a number of the nobility. All were attended also by a vast number of boats, great and small. Cortes ordered out a party composed of Velasquez de Leon, Alvarado, de Oli, and Avila, all men who had blood in their eyes, and 200 soldiers, giving them orders to be very watchful over Montezuma. 4 brass guns with their ammunition and artillerymen were also embarked. A wind blew very fresh. Our sailors took delight in exhibiting their skill, and the ship seemed to fly across the lake, leaving the vessels of the natives far behind. Montezuma, being arrived where he was to hunt, landed for that purpose, and the place abounded with game. He had soon killed a great quantity of various kinds, such as deer, hares, and rabbits. After having amused himself for some time in this manner, he returned on board the vessel and set sail for Mexico. We discharged our artillery during the voyage, which afforded him amusement and satisfaction, and he delighted us all by his affable and friendly behavior. Nor is it possible to describe how noble he was in everything he did, nor the respect in which he was held by every one about him. One day 3 of our captains were in his presence, and when a hawk entered the apartments pursuing a quail, which kind of birds as well as doves bred in and about the palaces. As our officers and soldiers were admiring the beauty and flight of the hawk and talking upon the subject in general, Montezuma was curious to know what we were saying, which being explained to him, and also how we could tame hawks and fly them in our hands, Montezuma said that he would order the bird to be caught for us, and giving immediate directions for that purpose, by the next morning his hunters had caught and brought us the identical bird. Cacamatzin, the king's nephew, and the prince of the city of Tezcuco, the largest next to Mexico in the empire, having received information that the king had been now kept many days prisoner by the Spaniards, and that they had opened the treasury of his ancestors in order to secure it by a timely effort, convoked his vassals and also the neighboring princes. Amongst them was the lord of Matalchingo, a great warrior and near relation of Montezuma, who was said to have pretension to the throne. These princes and chiefs he summoned in order to induce them to assemble their forces and fall upon us in a body. When they were met in consultation upon this proposition, the prince whom I before mentioned to have had pretensions to the throne made the support of them the condition of his entering into the confederacy. Kakamatsin then brought forward a similar claim, declaring that he would go through the business with his own force, for which purpose he made arrangements with his friends in the city of Mexico. This coming to the knowledge of Montezuma, he immediately forbid any such steps being taken, and communicated to Cortes the information which he had received. The transaction was already in a certain degree known to us, but not to the full extent. Cortes, in consequence thereof, proposed to take with him a body of Mexicans to attack and destroy the city of Tezcuco, but this determination not being satisfactory to Montezuma, Cortes sent to Cacamatzin, desiring him to desist from his warlike preparations, as he wished for him as his friend. Cacamatzin replied that he was not to be duped like any others by plausible words, that he expelled soon to see us, that we might say to him that which we would. Cortes once again lent to Cacamatzin warning not to proceed to hostilities, the consequence of which would be the loss of the king's life, to which his chief returned for answer that neither the king nor Cortes were of any consequence to him, for that he was determined to persevere in his intentions. He had at this time a brother in Mexico, who had been obliged to fly thither on account of a family quarrel. This being known to us, our general proposed to Montezuma to call the reigning prince to his court, where we could seize on and detain him until he became more amenable, or if we thought proper, elevate the brother now in Mexico to his place. Montezuma agreed to send for him, adding that if he refused to come, he would give directions for having him brought by force. For this Cortes returned him thanks with many professions of sincere regard, alluring him that he rade by him entirely for his protection, and that for his part he should be happy to accompany him to his palace, and that he could not get his captains to consent to it. The king thanked him, and said that he would immediately send to inform Cacamatzin of his true situation, and how it was adopted by his own free will, and by the advice of his gods. For Montezuma was perfectly well acquainted with dissimulation practiced by Cortes, and that it was only done in order to sound him. Montezuma, according to his promise, sent a message to the prince, who perfectly understood the manner in which it was obtained, and declared his determination to attack us in 4 days, saying that his uncle the king was a pitiful monarch, and no better than a hen, for not having attacked us as he advised him at the pass of Chalco. That for his part he was determined to avenge the wrongs that had been committed on us upon Montezuma and the country, that if in doing the throne of Mexico fell to his lot, he would liberally reward those who supported him. Some of the chiefs who had heard these declarations had scruples upon the subject, objecting to go to war without the orders of their sovereign. This filled the prince with rage, especially when they proposed to send to him for his instructions, and he caused 3 of them to be taken prisoners, and the others who were present, intimidated thereby, declared their determination to support him. He then sent a message to Montezuma representing the disgrace in which he was fallen, by connecting himself with wizards and magicians, and that he would come and put us all to death. Montezuma was highly offended at this, and taking off a seal, he entrusted it to the care of 6 of his captains, commanding them to go and shew it to certain persons who he named, as knowing they were not on terms of friendship with the prince, and to signify them his orders, that they should seize Cacamatzin and send him to his presence. Accordingly, they entered where the prince was, discoursing with some of his chiefs relative to his expedition, and having secured him, together with 5 others, embarking them in a piragua, they brought him to Mexico, where Cacamatzin was placed in one of the royal litters and conducted into the presence of Montezuma. The king, after having reproached him for his disobedience and treason, delivered him to Cortes to do what he thought proper with him, releasing the other prisoners. Cortes thanked the great Montezuma and made arrangements that the brother of Cacamatzin should succeed the principality by the name of Don Carlos, and he was accordingly invested with this dignity in the presence of Montezuma. The other chiefs who had joined in the measures of Cacamatzin absented themselves from court through fear, but were shortly made prisoners and brought to Mexico in chains. Thus was concluded this important business to our entire satisfaction. We continued still paying our court to Montezuma in the manner so great and generous a prince deserved, never sitting down, not even Cortes himself, in his presence until the king commanded it. The conversation frequently turned upon our holy religion, and the truths thereof seemed to be every day making more impression upon the king's mind. Cortes now entered again upon the subject of Montezuma's acknowledging the sovereignty of our emperor, to which Montezuma replied that he would summon the princes of his vassals, which he accordingly did, and nearly the whole of them attended within the space of 10 days. Among the few who absented themselves was the relation of Montezuma's already spoken of, and as of extraordinary prowess in war, who returned for answer that he would neither come or pay any more tribute. The king was incensed at this, and sent officers to apprehend him, but without success. The princes being assembled and the little page present, Montezuma reminded them of the ancient prophecies, whereby they were told that from these parts where the sun rises, men were to come to rule the country, and that with their arrival should seize the empire of the Mexicans. The king added that for his part he believed we were the people spoken of, that he had sacrificed to his gods, requesting in vain an answer from them, but they referred him to the former ones, and commanded him to ask no more, whereby he concluded their will to be that obedience should be yielded to the king of Castile, for whom these strangers were vassals. I now, continued he, beseech you to give them some token of submission. They require it of me. Let no one refuse. For 18 years that I have reigned, I have been a kind monarch to you. You have been faithful subjects to me. Since my gods will have it so, indulge me by this one instance of obedience. The princes, with many sighs and tears, promised Montezuma, who was still more affected than them, that they would do whatever he desired. He then sent a message to Cortez, telling him that on the ensuing day he and his princes would tender their allegiance to his majesty our emperor. This they accordingly did at the time appointed, in the presence of all our officers, many of our soldiers, not one of whom who could refrain from weeping, in beholding the agitation and distress of the great and generous Montezuma. Cortez and his captains being in the presence of Montezuma, conversing about indifferent subjects, the general took an opportunity to ask some questions relative to the gold mines. Montezuma told him that the richest were in the province of Zacatuala, and he gave an account of the manner in which the gold was obtained, and which was, by washing the earth, the small grains of metal sinking to the bottom. He also informed Cortez that they obtained it in 2 rivers in the province of Guertepeque, where the natives did not obey him, but that if Cortez would send some troops thither, he could order his officers to conduct them. Cortez thanked the king, and pitched upon the pilot of Umbria and 2 soldiers to examine the mines of Zacatula. To those in the Chincantecan and Zapotecan territories he sent a captain named Pizarro, a young man, his relation. But at the time the names Pizarro and Peru were equally unknown. The latter took with him 4 soldiers used to mining, and 4 noble Mexicans. Montezuma then presented Cortez with a map admirably painted in cloth of the whole northern coast, so far as Tabasco, in extent 140 leagues. Among the rivers was that of Guacahualca, which Cortez determined to have examined, and Diego de Ordaz, offering himself, was accepted by Cortez contrary to his own inclination, as he was a person from whose advice and judgment he derived great advantage. Montezuma told de Ordaz that his departure, that his power did not extend to where he was going, and that if he wished for the assistance of his frontier garrisons, he was welcome to take them. The first who returned was Gonzalo de Umbria. He brought with him gold to the value of 300 crowns, and reported that the mines would be very valuable if they were as expert at business there as in Santo Domingo or Cuba. 2 principal persons in that country also attended him to Mexico, and brought a present of gold to about 100 crowns value, offering to become his majesty's subjects. Thus, having ascertained the situation of the mines was a matter of great satisfaction to Cortez. Umbria described the country in which he had been as very rich and populous, and indeed he and his companions seemed to have returned no way the worse for their journey, and Cortez intended that it should be so, in order to make up their former differences. Diego de Ordaz reported that he had passed through very populous districts, and had been universally well received, that he had met with bodies of the troops of Montezuma on the frontiers, of whose outrages the inhabitants made heavy complaints, for which de Ordaz severely reprehended the military chiefs, threatening them with the punishment of the Lord of Nahuatlan. Proceeding towards the river, he was hospitably received by the caciques and inhabitants of the neighboring country. On sounding the mouth of the river, they found 3 fathom water at low tide, in the shallowest part, and within the bar water sufficient for large ships, it still deepening as they went higher up. He also found a place fit for a naval establishment, where the natives came to him and offered themselves as vassals to his majesty, complaining bitterly of Montezuma and his officers. They also pointed out to our people the place where, in a late action, had killed many of his troops, which they had in consequence named Quilameque, which is to say the place of the slaughter of the Mexicans, giving to them a most opprobrious epithet. He further represented the soil of the country is fit for cattle and tillage, and the port is well situated for trade with Cuba, St. Domingo, and Jamaica, but disadvantageous in regard to his distance from Mexico and the morasses in its neighborhood. Pizarro mourned from Tustapeque with gold and grains to the value of 1,000 crowns. He related how he ascended into the mountains inhabited by the Chinkatecans, who sallied out under arms and refused to suffer the Mexicans to come to them, vowing that they would kill them if they attempted it. But our people were admitted willingly, and they obtained gold in its native place with a rough surface. Pizarro brought with him certain of the chiefs of the country, who wished to renounce the Mexican yoke and become subjects of his majesty. These Cortez received most kindly and dismissed to their homes with a promise of support and protection. He then inquired for other soldiers, to which Pizarro replied that the country being rich and the people well inclined to us, had left them to make a plantation of cocoa, to collect stock and birds, and also for the purpose of exploring the rivers and mines. Cortez said nothing at the time, but severely reprimanded him in private for going beyond his orders and employing the soldiers in such ridiculous pursuits. He also immediately sent off a messenger with orders for them to return to their headquarters. Cortez now demanded of Montezuma a general contribution of gold to be made through the whole extent of his territories to our emperor, and also that the king should deliver to us his treasure for the same purpose. Montezuma immediately sent his officers to those districts where the mines were, requiring a quantity of plates of gold, of the usual size paid in tribute, 2 of these being sent as a standard. He at this time, however, remarked to Cortez that for many of his districts gold was not to be expected in any considerable quantity, the people only possessing such toys as had been transmitted to them from their ancestors. Much gold was immediately transmitted from the rich provinces, but when the order was received by the refractory lord, who was nearly related to Montezuma, the answer which was returned to us was he would pay no tribute, for that he had as good a right to the throne of Mexico as Montezuma himself. This greatly enraged the king, who immediately sending trusty officers with his token, the seal, they apprehended and brought this chief to Mexico. When he came into the presence of the king, he behaved with such insolence to him as appeared to border upon madness. And Cortez, learning of these particulars, and also that Montezuma had ordered him to be put to death, interceded in his favor and obtained leave to keep him in his custody. As soon as he had an interview, he addressed this chief very kindly and endeavored to make a friend of him, offering him his liberty, which, however, Montezuma would not accede to, but destined he should be put in chains as others had been. In 20 days from the time of the orders being issued, the tribute was collected. The king then summoned Cortez with the captains and soldiers who usually formed his guard and addressed us, saying, "Know that I am indebted to your great king and esteem him, and for having sent an embassy to me from such a distance, and also because I am convinced that according to what we have heard from our ancestors, he is to rule us, a prophecy which is confirmed by the declarations of our gods. Take this gold, which is all that could be collected in so short a notice, and also the treasure which I derive from my ancestors, and for which I know you have seen. Send it to your monarch, and let it be recorded that in your annals that this was the tribute of his vassal Montezuma. I will give you, for your emperor, some most valuable jewels named calchiquiles, each of which is worth 2 loads of gold. I will also send 3 tubes used for shooting darts or pellets, so richly adorned with jewels that he will be pleased to see them. For this which I now give is the last of the treasure which has remained with me." We all took off our helmets and returned thanks to the great Montezuma for his liberality and munificence, which Cortez promised he would represent in the strongest terms to his majesty. After some more conversation, Montezuma commanded his officers to deliver us the treasure which was in the concealed apartment. This was accordingly done, and we were for the space of 3 days constantly employed in taking it to pieces from the various manners in which it was worked up. In this we were assisted by the royal goldsmiths from Escapuzalco. When thus separated, the articles of gold were formed in 3 heaps, weighing upwards of 600,000 crowns, exclusive of the various other valuables, the golden plates and bars, and the metal in its rough state from the mines. The goldsmiths melted down the metal which was in the heaps, and ran it into bars of the breadth of 3 fingers. When this was done, another present was received from Montezuma, so rich it was worthy of admiration, exclusive of the jewels called calchiquiles, the ornamented tubes covered with jewels, and the pearls, and beautiful embroideries of pearls and feathers, and the panaches, or plumage, a recital whereof would be endless. The bars of gold were stamped with the imperial arms by the approbation of us all, and as to the rich ornaments, it was judged that they should not be taken to pieces. We also caused weights to be made of iron for the purpose of ascertaining the quality of the gold in the bars. They were not perfectly exact, but perhaps an ounce or more less, being arrobas, half arrobas, and down to 4 ounces. The officers of His Majesty valued the gold altogether, and exclusive of silver and ornaments, at 100 shares to the officers' ornaments, at 100,000 crowns, but some said it amounted to more. Nothing farther than thought necessary than to deduct His Majesty's fifth, and distribute the shares to officers and soldiers. Cortez, however, proposed that the divisions should be postponed until more treasure was brought in, with more exact weights made. But the soldiers were clamorous for an immediate division, and they perceived that since the various articles had been taken to pieces, above a 1/3 part was already gone, for Cortez, the captains, and others were conveying it off and concealing it. At length it was determined to weigh it, and to postpone the division until the ensuing day. It was accordingly so done, and exclusive of the ornaments and plates of gold, it was found to amount to upwards of 600,000 crowns. I will now relate how it was divided, and how most of it remained with Cortez and certain others. In the partition of the treasure, Cortez first laid aside His Majesty's fifth, secondly for himself another fifth, thirdly a portion of the gold to reimburse the expenses in the island of Cuba, and also for the naval expenditure incurred by Velasquez in the destruction of the ships, fourthly for the expenses of our agents in Spain, fifthly for our soldiers in Villarica, sixthly for the loss of killed horses, seventhly for the Reverend Father and the captains, eighthly double shares for the cavalry, musketeers, and crossbowmen. Thus by the time all these drafts were made, what remained for each soldier was hardly worth stooping for. Many refused to take their shares, and the whole nearly remained with Cortez. We were obliged to be silent, for to whom could we appeal for justice? Some at length took their shares at 100 crowns, then cried out for more. These men's mouths Cortez stopped, giving privately a little to one and a little to another, with promises in abundance on condition they kept themselves quiet. That which was allotted to the soldiers in Villarica went no better, as shall be related in its place, and such was the result of the division of Montezuma's treasure. Our captains got chains of gold made for them by the king's workmen. Cortez also had similar works executed for him, together with a service of plate. Many of our soldiers who had lined their pockets well did the same, and deep gaming went on day and night, with cards made out of the heads of drums, and thus we passed our time in Mexico. Quitting for the present the subject of Montezuma's gold badly divided and worse employed, I will relate what happened to a poor fellow, one Cardenas, a pilot and native of Triana. He had a wife and children, and like many others of us, little or nothing to give them. When he perceived that all that is this immense treasure of Montezuma's had dwindled into a share of 100 crowns, and that he, after all his battles, had nothing to expect in the future but hard blows, it made such an impression on him that he expressed himself so loudly that it could not but come to the ears of Cortez. Accordingly, when he heard all that, and much more, which had been said, he called us together, and in a long set speech gave us great many honeyed words, with which he had an extraordinary facility of doing, wondering how we could be so solicitous about a little paltry gold, when the whole country soon would be ours, with its rich mines, wherewith there was enough to make us great lords and princes, and I know not what. To the more loud he gave all some small presents, and to Cardenas he secretly promised to send 300 crowns for his wife and child. This Cardenas was afterwards very troublesome to him. As all men are avaricious, as with most the desire requiring increases with what they possess, and as it was well known that a great quantity of valuable pieces of gold was taken out of the treasury, suspicion naturally fell on several. One, Velasquez de Leon, he had then some large chains of gold and trinkets and ornaments of that metal in the hands of the king's workmen, and the treasurer Mejia, knowing of it, and also how he had procured the gold, laid claim to them. But de Leon resisted, saying it had already been given to him by Cortez, before it was ran into bars, to which the treasurer replied that Cortez had concealed enough and taken enough from his soldiers already, without giving him so great a quantity. The quarrel arose so high between them, both being valiant men, that they drew their swords, and before they could be parted, each had received 2 wounds. Cortez, on hearing it, ordered them to be put to arrest, and in chains. This he did to keep up appearances, having privately spoken to de Leon, who was his particular friend, and desired him to submit quietly, and the other he released in consideration of his office as treasurer. Velasquez was a strong man, and used to walk much backwards and forwards in the apartment where he was confined. Montezuma, hearing the rattling of his chains, inquired who it was, and being told, he interceded with Cortez for him on the first opportunity. Cortez, laughing, replied that Velasquez was a mad fellow, and if he did not keep him confined, he would go up and down the country robbing the Majesty's subjects of their gold. The good king said if it was only on that account that he was detained, he would supply his wants, and begged that he might be released. Cortez affected to make a favor of it, but at length agreed, declaring that he would banish him from his headquarters. Accordingly, he went as far as Cholula, but in 6 days returned, richer by the king's gold than he went. After this, Cortez and Mejia were never great friends. The king at this time made a proposal of marriage to Cortez, offering him one of the princesses, his daughters. This offer Cortez received as it merited, and suggested the propriety of her being previously initiated into the mysteries of our holy religion by being baptized, to which the king, who was on all occasions compliant, immediately assented. He, however, continued as attached as ever to his worship and sacrifices, which put Cortez and his captains to a dilemma, but it thought most consistent with their duties as Christians to incur the danger of insurrection and destroy the idols of the Mexicans in order to plant the true cross in their place. Or if that was found impossible, we resolved to content ourselves for the present with making a chapel for the Christian worship in the temple. 7 officers and soldiers attended Cortez when he waited on Montezuma to signify to him our resolution. When it was made known to him, and he saw the violence with which the measure was determined to be carried into effect, he earnestly begged permission to consult his priests, and Cortez, appearing touched with his situation, made signs to the officers and soldiers to retire, and leave the king with him and the reverend father. He then told him that in order to accommodate the matter more to his satisfaction, he would endeavor to prevail with his officers for the present to offer no violence to the idols, provided a great part of the temple was appropriated for the purpose of a chapel, and an altar and crucifix allowed to be placed there, which being done once, his majesty would in short time be convinced of the errors and falsehood of his worship. To this Montezuma, with much agitation and the appearance of deep sorrow, heavily consented, and in consequence, an altar and crucifix being erected, Mass was solemnly said, and a person was appointed to take care of the chapel. The time of our stay in the city was one series of alarms, sufficient in themselves to have destroyed the lives of those who were not supported by the divine interposition. It appeared that in consequence of our late measure and the representations of the priests acting upon the prejudices of the people, our dangers were now thickening on us. Their gods threatened to leave them unless we were put to death for having violated their temple, and it was the determination to obey their will. This resolution was communicated to Montezuma by his priests and all his chief warriors, who, added to their religious subject to compliant, every other which they could collect relative to our conduct, find we arrived in Mexico. The page Ortegea also at this time came forward to inform Cortez of some alarming circumstances, such as a number of secret conferences which he had observed between Montezuma and his nobility and chiefs, the angry and melancholy countenance of the king, and other circumstances highly important and interesting to us. Cortez immediately on hearing this, taking with him 5 of his captains and his interpreters, waited on Montezuma. The king seemed much distressed and informed him that he was grieved to have lately learned that it was the determination of his gods that we should all be put to death or expelled from Mexico. He therefore, being our sincere friend, recommended it to us on no account to run the risk, but to save our lives, whilst it could be done by a speedy retreat. Cortez and the rest could not conceal their uneasiness on hearing this, and no wonder. The general, however, immediately replied that he was on that occasion much grieved at 2 things. One was not having his vessels ready for the purpose of returning. The other, that in case of his doing so, he should be under the necessity of taking his majesty with him, in order to present him to his sovereign the emperor. He therefore entreated Montezuma that he would restrain his priests and warriors until he should have time to build 3 ships, saying if this were not acceded to, we were all resolved to die to the very last man. And as a proof of the sincerity of his determination to depart, he declared that he would immediately send his shipbuilders to fell wood and construct the vessels on the coast. The determination of Cortez to bring Montezuma with him made that monarch more distressed and dejected than ever. Cortez then repeated his assurance of no unnecessary delay, and desired the assistance of the king's carpenters in constructing the vessels, at the same time requesting his influence with the priests and nobility to prevent any insurrection in the city, and his endeavors to appease his gods, provided it were not by human sacrifices. Cortez immediately proceeded to execute his determination of building 3 ships, contrary to what is related to by Gomara, who says that the whole was as feint, in order to lull Montezuma and his subjects. But on the contrary, Martin Lopez, the principal carpenter who is now living, has assured me that he really did, and in good earnest, set about the work, and that the vessels were actually on the stocks. During this time we remained very pensive and sad in the city of Mexico from the precariousness of our situation, expecting every moment to be attacked. Our apprehensions were increased by the informations obtained by Donna Marina, and the terror and tears of the page, who, understanding the language, obtained hints which escaped our knowledge. We kept, however, good and constant watch on Montezuma, and guard on our quarters, never sleeping out of our armor, and our horses were constantly bridled and saddled all night. Without meaning to boast, I say of myself that my armor was to me as easy as the softest down, and such is my custom, that when I now go to the rounds of my district, I never take a bed with me unless I happen indeed to be attended by strange cavaliers, in which case I do it only in order to avoid the appearance of poverty or penuriousness, but by my faith, even when I have one, I always throw myself on it in my clothes. Such it is to be a true soldier. Another peculiarity I have is, I cannot sleep through the night, but always awaken and get up in order to contemplate the heavens and the stars, and thus amuse myself, walking backwards and forwards, as I used to do when on guard, for a good space of time, without hat or cap, and glory be to God. I never yet caught cold, nor was a jot the worse for it. And this the reader must pardon me for mentioning, if it not being from vanity, but that I wish to know what kind of men we, the true-bred soldiers and real conquerors of Mexico, were. Okay, that was the end of part 3. Look forward next week to part 4, which will contain the flight of Cortez and his soldiers from the city of Mexico and the eventual return of the conquistadors with their Indian allies to destroy the main city of the Mexicans.